Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I talk with Stephen Clouse. Stephen Clouse is almost with his PhD in political science and philosophy, and his expertise is in Aristotle, and that's what his dissertation was on. A lot of his work is on Aristotle and his thought. In this conversation, we talked about many fascinating things, which I think are interesting in terms of philosophy, but also in terms of kind of the application of some of these ways of thinking for our current moment. So we get into the differences between political philosophy and political science. We talk about the study of regime as an intersection of political science and political philosophy. We talk about political theory overall. We use an example of political theory using Marx, and we talk a little bit about the systemic approach for power and ideology. We talk a little bit about the use of etymology and understanding kind of the base roots of words as ways to continue to understand things, mostly because modern language is kind of watered down iterations of where words come from. He gave a really nice synthesized aspect of what America is, being liberal, federated, democratic republic, and some of the differences. We talk about a kind of a brief history of philosophy and some of the challenges with postmodern deconstruction philosophy. And then we jump into the background history of the Greeks and then of Aristotle himself. He spent a lot of time talking about the importance and relevance of studying Aristotle for modern times. He talked about specifically Aristotle's idea of purpose and how it interacts with leisure. He talked about Aristotle's tragedy in terms of a class, the tragedies, much like the comedies. And we also talk about Aristotle's use of pity, or more accurately, or probably more, a better translation would be empathy, and some of the importance of role play for ethics, and a bunch of other topics. This was a really great conversation. I greatly enjoyed it. I always like talking philosophy, and Steve has a really good way of explaining philosophy and really explaining the concepts, but then not making it too highbrow without dumbing down or watering down the information. So he's really just brilliant. Again, I could talk to him for hours and hours about this stuff. So hopefully we'll be able to do that sometime soon. There's just one note that we did where there was a small misstep. He had confused a little bit of the musical types. He told me to just kind of make a note. It's Dorian and Phrygian, not Dorian and Lydian. So just as a small note there for all the people keeping track. So this is a great conversation. I hope you all enjoy it. And I now bring you Stephen Clouse. I am here with Stephen Clouse. Stephen, what's going on, man?
Oh, not a lot. Thanks for having me on.
Of course, man. Of course. You're another connection that I've found online. You have a really nice presence online, mainly Twitter, and have some really, really wonderful thoughts. And so I wanted to get you on here and talk about a lot of really fun stuff, at least fun for me. This I suspect will be heavy philosophy, which I'm always jazzed up to talk about. I sometimes can be very hard to find people that intelligently can do philosophy. So I always have a fun time when I get to talk to people. So thanks for coming on. Tell everybody, tell the listeners just a little bit about yourself, kind of your background, any pertinent degrees or experience, what you're currently doing, and kind of future plans and anything you've written or all that good stuff.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for the kind words about me and my rambling online. I appreciate that. That's very kind. I am currently ABD in political philosophy, and so I should be knocking on all the wood. And if anybody's listening, please hit all the wood you can. I should be done in May.
There you go, man. That's great.
So I have a master's degree in that. I also have a master's degree in secondary education.
Oh, cool.
And undergrad, I double majored in history and political science. I'm the first one of my family to go to college. I'm the first one to graduate from high school.
Wow.
So yeah, it's fun. You learn a lot about the academy when no one has ever experienced it before. You realize how much of a gating effect there really is.
Oh yeah.
When you're coming in from the outside. So that's useful. Currently, I am adjuncting at a couple of different universities. I live in southern Wisconsin, so I'm adjuncting in a couple of different places here and in northern Illinois. And I teach primarily political philosophy and American government. My dissertation is on Aristotle and the use of poetry in Aristotle's political thought. And I've taught multiple courses on American political thought. So I kind of dabble in a bunch of stuff. So I think that's most about me. I've published on an American thinker from the 19th century named Orestes Brownson. If anybody has heard of him, I want you to eat a cookie because that's amazing because nobody reads about Brownson. And it led to a really interesting exploration of the 14th Amendment and the Civil War and the Reconstruction. And then I have a couple of other smaller non-peer-reviewed pieces at Areo on things like about liberalism and ideas in the culture war and that kind of stuff. So that's most broadly about me.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I think just picking up about what you're saying about the kind of gatekeeping and stuff. That's also true for me as well. I was the first person in my family to get a doctorate. I had a few cousins that have a master's degree, and a few folks that have a bachelor's. But I was the one that was crazy enough. We're the oddballs. I was crazy enough to spend 15 years getting in my head in a textbook, and yeah, it does. There is an interesting dynamic that's there, and so it's maybe we'll get into some of that. So that's yeah, that's fabulous. That's great. It's interesting. It sounds like philosophy was later for you, I guess, in a kind of more formal sense.
So I started, my first sort of exposure to it came from, I was in high school and looked at our public access channel, as everyone does. And the local college had a professor on, and he was teaching in political philosophy, a class. And I'm fairly sure he was talking about Plato and the Apology. And I just sat and watched the whole thing, as a 17-year-old is going to do. And at that point, I said, this is really interesting. I'd never been exposed to anything like this. So I enrolled in that local college, a university, and I took a class with him, Introduction to Political Philosophy. And from that point on, I was hooked. So my degrees are in political science, but I do political theory, which is political philosophy in a political science department.
Okay. Yeah.
And, but I also, then took all the other political science courses on it. But I took 11 courses in political theory as an undergrad, so 33 credit hours in it.
Whoa.
So, I took all of them that I could.
Wow.
So yeah, I don't know that everyone should be as much of a drug addict on their major as I was, but I really, I got invested in it and spent a lot of time thinking about it. And the piece I actually ended up co-authoring with that professor. So it has sort of a nice through line, I suppose.
No, that's great.
So yeah, I guess I did start early. Even if on the nameplate it doesn't necessarily say so.
Sure. Yeah. No, it's great. So yeah, let's jump right into that. Will bleed in nicely to I think like the first thing I wanted to ask you about. So when you're done in May, it's going to say PhD. Yeah, you'll get there. You'll get there. You'll be fine. And once you get that, it's going to say PhD in political philosophy. Yeah.
It'll be in political science. I'm getting in the political science department.
Political science. Okay. So, maybe explain a little bit about some of the differences between political science political philosophy, and then maybe those separately, politics and philosophy. I guess more traditionally in terms of academia, and then maybe more kind of mainstream or kind of colloquial way.
Sure. So there's the really, I'll be nice and say learned answer that political philosophy is the oldest thing one can study. I mean, at least philosophy broadly goes back to the Greeks. Political philosophy goes back at least to Plato.
Mm-hmm.
And so people have been studying the ideas of politics philosophically in the Western tradition for 2,500 years.
I was going to say, trying to get a timestamp of Plato again.
So he's in the 4th century. So it's about 2,500 years of stuff that's written down in the Western tradition.
Mm-hmm.
There are other things that have come from other places, or the writings have been lost. But what I've been trained in is mostly in the Western tradition. So that's really all I should speak on.
Mm-hmm.
So that goes all the way back to that. And it's really based, at least in the Socratic way, which everyone is in political philosophy until we get to the 20th century. And so we can get to that because that's wrapped up in the answer here. It really is based in asking questions like, what is this phenomenon? What is justice? What is friendship? What is love? What is whatever the animating concern is? What is ethics? And then you explore it from that perspective, typically either through like an inductive process where I look into the world and see phenomenon and try to extrapolate from it to a higher understanding, or deductively. I start with a concept and then I work downward from there to the general application. And so political philosophy tends to operate on that level. What are the concepts and principles? Frequently, that's maybe the best way of understanding it. It's a degree in examining claims on first principles. And people who have studied it, even the ones who weren't credentialed, basically are engaging in that same thing. Political science, alternatively, emerges out of political philosophy, we could say, but it's really a creation of sort of the credentialization of the university that happened at the end of the 19th century. You get this out of the German school that emerges, during the unification of Germany from Bismarck and this kind of stuff, comes to the U.S., get your first PhDs at Hopkins, and then it sort of breaks down, and all modern disciplines sort of break in from that. And political science really comes to its fore in the 1950s and is really an examination, probably most accurately, of the American and British systems of government, and then everybody else. And so it's really starts out as examining what are formal institutions and formal constitutions, and or in the British system, since they don't have a written constitution, it's the precedents and traditions upon which they believe themselves to be governed, or various acts of parliament or judiciary rulings, these kinds of things. Then it turns into a more, I hate this language, but a harder social science by adding in econometrics and things from, our economist friends. Psychology, I think, goes through something very similar, probably in the early to mid 1960s. And you have the behavioralist revolution, and things become far more data driven. You need a big N. And so in that sense, political science really is trying to do the same thing that other social sciences are doing, I think, which is giving an account of the world as we perceive it. It can't really do what natural science wants to do, which is sort of, or at least to my estimation anyway, is what is the world in front of us and how can we make it useful for us? Social science can't really do that second part yet. We may actually have an ethical aversion to it ever doing that piece. Because if I can understand, whatever you're actually, social media may be a very good test on whether or not we want that to actually be the goal of social science. How much should we be using psychology to make us addicted to these things? So there's the really good intersection between political science and political philosophy. You've brought in a bunch of data. You've given an assessment of what is. Now the next question is, how should that what is be used?
And that's the philosophy side that comes into to play here.
That's right. So my role in a department, by mine, I mean political theory, is really to annoy everybody else. Why should you do this?
Steve's coming over here with all this theory. Oh,
that's right. That's right. He keeps asking me why. I want to know how. Quit asking me this question. Go away. So yeah, that's really the internal dynamics in a department. I will say, for the most part, the trend in political science departments is to move away from philosophic questions, and there are less and less political philosophers being hired, political theorists in political science. Some major universities have actually gotten rid of their theory departments altogether, and which I, of course, I think that's my life would have been dramatically different had I not had those opportunities to read and study these things when I was 18, 19 years old. So
sure, yeah, of course.
But we can come back to that. To answer the other portion of your question, so if that lays out what the disciplines are and sort of how the department dynamics, in a lay sort of understanding, the difference between sort of politics and philosophy, politics is the thing on TV that pisses you off every time you see it, right? It's these people, they're lying to us, they're a bunch of scum, whatever.
Right.
But I'm going to vote back in my congressman at like 93% retention. It's always, it's your guy that's mucking it up, not my guy.
Right.
So and I think what we mean by politics, and I see this a lot on social media. People do this, they're politically motivated or they've got this political aspect. I think they mean partisan.
Yeah.
It's not really politics. It's that they're lining up to some sort of policy preferences.
Or some type of, or kind of the polarization within that is kind of the probably the more finer, nuanced way of explaining it is probably a better way to say.
Yep. We've just collapsed the term down to where politics basically just means something I don't like.
Yeah.
And where philosophy, so this is, I don't actually have a whole lot of formal training in formal philosophy as such in the sort of 20th century. Philosophy is kind of weird in the history of it anyway, because it really gets reset at the beginning of the 20th century, right?
Yes.
With Wittgenstein, and it sort of changes and in essence kind of becomes, you get the parsing out philosophy of whatever the thing is, philosophy of language, philosophy of math, philosophy of science. And it really becomes, in a certain sense, a different kind of language structure that we end up arguing about. Not that wasn't part of philosophy beforehand, because it was. How could it not be? You're engaging with reason, so it's going to involve words. But this is really using words as math. And so I don't have a whole lot of formal training in that. My wife does, so I've kind of got secondhand knowledge, I guess, of it. Mostly from listening to her complaining about so-and-so saying something stupid. But, what are you going to do?
Right.
But the way we think about philosophy today, I think sort of in the popular mind anyway, is people sitting around asking pointless questions or blathering on about pointless things. It's not relevant, or it's people in this ivory tower, ivory towering.
Yeah, it's a very, cerebral, sanctimonious, looking down, navel gazing, like, here's all these big abstractions and, we're going to, talk down to you about how all of our ideas are amazing and you don't understand them.
Right, exactly. Which is, it's so far from the foundations of what philosophy was. Now, that's pretty true of like scholastic philosophy in the medieval period, which, sort of modern academic philosophers. And I think that word is a pretty good indication. We have those two layers of meaning: academic, meaning you work in the academy, and academic, meaning pointless. Right.
Yeah.
That sort of stuff borders on the scholastic, listen to so-and-so just go on and on and on about whatever they know. Where when you read, say, like Plato or Aristotle, they're just taking up common arguments, common notions, and they're starting from where people are and attempting to reason through the things and arguments that they're hearing. In a certain sense, philosophy is a lot more the barriers to access are much lower.
Mm-hmm.
But because the barriers are so much lower, a lot of people think that they're doing philosophy when what they're probably doing is like foolishness. They're not actually like engaging in something serious. It's just something else that's entertaining, which both Plato and Aristotle are very aware of. Or you have the other kind of people who, and I won't besmirch anybody's honor, but imagine someone online who makes arguments about semantic differences and is in essence an intellectual troll. I know we can't think of anybody like this, but if someone comes to mind, they're in essence a sophist.
Yeah.
And that's the other big danger of philosophy. It teaches you the tools to deconstruct arguments to make someone else look completely foolish when you yourself are nothing but an ass.
Yeah.
So that's one of the great dangers of lowering the access to philosophy. It's sort of the same reason why the Catholic Church didn't want people to read the Bible forever.
Right.
Because you can get it and get it wrong. And then, you're sending a whole bunch of people to hell. That's not good.
Yeah. And very much it was the gatekeeper is a very mild way of putting it. I mean, they had that, sort of kind of literally, like a lockbox, right? Printing press, blew that wide open. And
sure.
So, yeah.
And so philosophy then in the modern sense, and I find this one to be really ironic. It's really when philosophy has its sort of breakdown, you have sort of three big trends now. You have, continental philosophy, which is doing sort of phenomenology and these kinds of things. Then you have the analytic school, which really is sort of in the Americans and the Brits, and they're mostly doing a lot of this semantic and linguistic kind of things. And then you have pragmatism, which is sort of the American unique contribution to philosophy, which is probably the reason why philosophy is no longer considered publicly relevant. One of the great ironies. And you get this from people like Josiah Royce because sort of today, and this is something I would really, really interested to talk to you about, why you think this is the case. So many of our public intellectuals today have backgrounds in psychology. 100 years ago, they were all in philosophy. And they were the ones sort of pushing it forward. Philosophy, in essence, abandoned its position as the forefront of public debate or public engagement, and philosophy fills it in sort of through the unfurling of the 20th century. So philosophy, in a certain sense, chooses its public sort of irrelevance, or it's thrust upon it, it doesn't reject it, as a consequence of this fracturing, or at least perhaps more accurately, those things coincide a bit. I'll be a bit more Humean and say I can't say causality here, right? But there's some correlation. There's a correlation in time between these things. And so what I like to do or try to do, and I kind of approach my social media this way, when the spirit moves me, I'll talk about stuff. But I don't ever try to do it in such a way that says, if you don't have an advanced degree in this, you're too dumb to know what's going on.
Right.
But I also really try not to do something where I say, I'm going to treat you as if you don't know anything. I think that that's just as dangerous to be condescending. You can come to arguments, say like from Locke and ideas of consent. You don't have to know Locke to know that that's what you're arguing.
Right.
It helps. It gives you a vocabulary to navigate the logic that's there, and to help you sort of anticipate counter arguments or pitfalls down the line in the logic. But some of these things you just get from living in a regime.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the best way to sort of button up this question. And I'm sorry, this is such an academic answer to your question.
No, it's great. That's great. Go ahead.
That the study of regime may be probably the thing that intersects or combines political philosophy and political science together still. And so what is a regime? A regime is the combination, or at least this is the way that I approach it, and I think this is pretty generally understood, is the combination of institutional power that's formalized and then power that's used informally. And so what we could say is this are things like laws and norms. And that really defines a regime. Political scientists, even some will go so far as to say that when you change who is in charge of a given system after an election, you have a regime change. So with the incoming Biden administration, there's a regime change. Mm-hmm. Others will say, no, it's not individuals, it's broad trends through time. One in particular who was influential on me, Stephen Clouse, the book is Presidents in Political Time, in essence argues that we can see political regimes rise and fall, where the ideas become entrenched, then they become sort of attacked against, then they become the centralized theme of an era, they become attacked again, and then the coalition falls apart. Mm-hmm. And so if you look at it like a bell graph, or a bell is the best way I think of thinking about it, his example comes from FDR. And you have FDR with the New Deal, then you have sort of the argument against it from Eisenhower. You get the Great Society that sort of starts with JFK, or the ideas start and they come really to a front in LBJ. You get the challenge again in Nixon. Then the whole sort of democratic regime that was created under FDR falls apart under Jimmy Carter. Mm-hmm. I think it's a really useful way of us thinking about contemporary politics in the same way, except for Reagan is serving as the replacement for FDR. Mm-hmm. Reagan, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the chaos that we're seeing sort of in contemporary politics, I think can at least be partially explained some by the falling apart of the coalition, the regime under Reagan that falls apart under the Trump administration. Others argue that regime isn't really that way, but is really defined as the character of a people. And that's more where political philosophy is operating. How do people understand themselves? What do they value? How do they act those values out? And so when we're talking about regimes, that's, I think, really what we're talking about, at least in some sense. The problem with that is sometimes there's, again, that big gap between how people live with politics and their relationship to it, and then how people perceive politics and their relationship to it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's all great. I have many thoughts. Okay. So let me kind of recap here, just so I make sure I understand. So political philosophy is kind of the more theoretical side of things, I guess you could say, as opposed to political science is the kind of big D data driven types of ways of understanding how things move. That's not to say that there isn't political theory in political science. Well, but so go ahead.
Well, it's also, I don't want to leave out my qualitative friends because I'll get burned in effigy for that. Yeah. Where they're not dealing with big N or big data. They're dealing with interviews and personal narratives and these kinds of things, right? Ethnography and these kinds of things, right? Yeah. So I tend to think of theoretical in the sense of it's, so in the Greek, a theory means to examine or look at closely. So all of social science is really engaging in theory as such. But in the formalized scientific method sense of theory, yes, that's more applicable to political science than political philosophy. So even again here, we're parsing words. We can't even get away from it. So in the one sense, political philosophy is doing theoretical work, a close examination of principles and ideas. Right. In another sense, it's not doing, here's my data, I come up with a hypothesis, I test it, that kind of theory building. It's not doing that. So just to clarify.
Yeah, I would say more of a kind of abstraction, if you will.
Yes.
Like what are some big ideas, I don't want to say heuristics, but some big kind of broad umbrellas of how we're understanding big concepts, first principles, meaning, kind of how do we understand ontology, study of being, how do we understand the physical world, the metaphysics, all of those things, certain values. And then the political science piece of it is doing a combination, just like it does in much of the other sciences. I mean, these sciences are usually preoccupied, with quantitative and qualitative data.
Yep.
You do that in social psych, you do that in sociology, you do that in clinical psych, you do that in political science. To make it a science in that sense is to do some type of, here are hypotheses, how do we test them out? Here's our, our ways of getting the data and then making certain statements about that. And again, I've spoken on the podcast a few times now about some of the finer points of difference between quantitative and qualitative data that we try to gather. And it isn't it's not a war between the two. People lean heavily on the quantitative. And I think probably probably one of the reasons why people lean on quantitative a little bit more than qualitative is quantitative gives you something tangible and something that you can wrap your head around. And it's very concrete. And it's typically holding off threats to external validity. So how does it generalize for many people?
Right.
In big groups, whereas qualitative stuff is really important, but you can't usually generalize it to big groups of people.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to falsify.
Right. So something about that you were saying about, so I think that's a really good distinction between political science, political philosophy, and then obviously the political theory probably dances between the two of sorts. And
we kind of are the redheaded stepchild of everyone. So because most people who do political theory, they're doing political philosophy in a political science department. But what that means is they're not really doing epistemology and ontology and metaphysics. They're mostly examining questions of ethics and sort of relationship with politics. And then, of course, within the subfield, there's 700 different approaches to it.
Right.
So, and I think that's perhaps the biggest difference with, let's say, our critical theory friends who really attack the notion of science, not as knowledge, but they're attacking it on the methodological level. That sort of like, that's really what I think makes a social science is the application of the scientific method as a way of trying to control for all of these, the biases that can come into anybody engaging in the search of knowledge. It's trying to make it to where if I pick up the same set of data, I'll come to the same conclusion that you do. That's, the end goal. Our critical theory friends sort of reject that entire premise. And
well, since we're here, let's maybe hit that a little bit. So, okay. So I think, broaden it out a little bit. So you have different theories that's what I was going to say. I was going to ask about the examples. So you have different theories that are espoused at different points. And, maybe you can say that there's certain, not to be ironic, political motivations for that or not. But let's give an example before the critical theory people of another type of theory. I think maybe a big one would be, Karl Marx. I mean, he had political theory. I mean, that's probably
sure. Okay.
In the 20th century, that's probably one of the biggest, biggest guys that was putting forward a new theory for how we do politics and how it impacts systems and government and institutions and, in some ways, cultural norms.
Yeah, sure. So there, again, this is a third definition to theory, because theory in this sense really is talking about a systematic approach to the use of power, and which I think is different than examining power or coming up with hypotheses to explain power. Yes. This is really, the word ideology would be substituted here. And I've really grown to hate this word because we've almost stretched it to the point of meaninglessness. But in sort of the Greek, which I try to use this whenever I can, etymology is my friend. Because at some point that word had a specific meaning. And and to be an ideologue really means to go ahead.
Let me just jump in there real quick, just for listeners. The reason why you'll hear you correct me if I'm wrong here, but the reason why you go down all the way to either Latin or Greek or sometimes German, you're trying to get at bottom, because our languages currently are messy, right? And there's no pure.
It's very polite.
There's no pure anything, and they're all mixed up, especially English. And so when you're, for example, I mean, there's Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, they all have a Latin base.
Right. And
so for much of the world, for a large period of time, Greek was, was the daddy of it all, right? I mean, it was, and insofar as that Greek had, especially Koine Greek or Common Greek, had very interesting ways of trying to explain different experiences and trying to explain different ways of being. And so they'll have certain things that come out in language of, there's at least 4 different ways of talking about love, right? And there'll be a certain word. And so the way the Greek language works is that it is very much specific in many ways. And it also depends on which you're using dative, generative, all that stuff. It's very systematic. It's very, but the biggest thing is that it's very specific to the concept you're trying to understand. So when people go to the etymology and they're trying to say, well, let's go to this concept has its origins typically in, for many it's Greek or Latin, or there's other ones, but this is where this first this term came out with this specific word that's used. And so now we've butchered it, 2,000 years later over many, many, many iterations, which doesn't make it invalid. But if you kind of want to get to bottom, you do want to go to the etymology. Is that about right? Or
I think that's exactly right. I'm going to use, this is how I start any class that is based in American political thought. I even do this some when I do my ancient thought class, but America, and then we'll get back to our ideology. But I think this is a useful detour.
Please.
So America, people ask, what is the American form of government? And we go, it's a democracy. And then you hear someone go, no, it's a republic. And it's like, well, they're both right and they're both wrong. Because if we're going to be super technical, the American form of government is a liberal, federated, democratic republic.
Yes.
And I'm sure I've even left something out there and someone can yell about that. But I think those are the 4 big things. We have, instead of saying long live the liberal, federated, democratic republic, we have compressed that into the word democracy.
Yeah.
And that's really a creation of the second half of the 19th century. Prior to that, democracy is a dirty, dirty word. But why? And I think here's where the etymology is really helpful. So democracy, for any of you that aren't familiar with this, the Greek is a combination of 2 words. The first half is demos, and the second half is kratia. And the first half, demos means the many or the peoples, but it's really the many. And the second word, kratia, is power. And so if any of you have played God of War, Kratos, he's power, literally powerful man, literally what that word means. So democracy is the many have the power. So for us, that means the people. Well, that's really something different because the people is a more inclusive term than the many, because the many is a majority. So a democracy is probably best understood as the rule of a majority.
Yeah.
A republic is a Latin word. This is from res in publica, res publica. Res is thing and publica is public. So it's the people's thing, the thing of the people, or the public's thing. And what's the thing that the public has most in common with everyone else beyond anything else within a given regime structure? So based on the horizon of a regime is the law, or it's the mechanism that governs it. So we can say a republic then is the rule of law. So what is a democratic republic? It is a place where the majority rules through the law. It doesn't rule directly. Instead, it has constraints on what it can do.
Right.
And so that perhaps where we can say, to add in what the American system is, it's a liberal, federated, democratic, constitutional republic, because it has all these other constraints that are built within it. All of those things have different claims on who should be governing, meaning who should have the power. Because if it's the law, then that is going to supersede the desire of any majority.
Right.
And we see this in constant action today.
Oh, yeah. The
clearest example on this is, I always do this to my students and they get frustrated, but it's good. It's good frustration. If a majority comes in and rules and says, I want X, should they be allowed to have X? Oh, yes, of course, right? Because everybody's a Democrat in this country. Small d, not a big D. Big D is the party, little d is the idea. Everybody's a Democrat. What if it's to ban a religion? Oh, no, they can't do that. Well, why not? Right? The majority's in charge. Aren't we a democracy? Well, no, they can't trample on the rights of political minorities. But why not? right? Well, the idea is you're actually appealing to something that's not democratic. You're appealing to something that's Republican, to not constrain the rights of the minority. Right. And what you're really doing is appealing to our written constitution, which outlines what a majority cannot do. Right? That's really sort of what the constraints in the Bill of Rights are about. To get to all of those conclusions, it's really helpful to understand what those words mean, so we can understand the tensions that are going on when we're talking about it, and why when people talk about the country is losing some of its democratic character. Well, what really is being lost there? Is it we aren't recognizing the will of the majority? Some of it may be that. It's we're not respecting the rights of individuals. Well, that's not really a democratic impulse. That's the liberal part of the country, the recognition of individuals and sort of their superior position relative to the commands of the collective. Well, the collective is another term for the majority, or it's another term for the people. So we have these layered tensions that are built into the American structure. It's really, really helpful to understand all of those words and their meanings instead of just saying it's a democracy. Because that it actually we want to say it's adding nuance, but to me, it's going from being black and white to being in color. You understand the contrast and shade so much better if you peel all this apart. So on the question of an ideology, the first half of that comes from the Greek word for the forms, an idea, literally it comes translated down to us. And the second part of that word means to be led by. And for the ology part would be to give an account or study of, right? So it's the logos of the forms. To be an ideologue means to govern or be driven by your knowledge of the forms. The way that we use that word really is sort of a 19th century, I'll use a non-loaded word, appropriation of this term to explain these systems of thinking, these schools of thought, perhaps is a better way of saying it. But what it means in its essence is you know what the truth is, and you know how to implement it with your use of power. And that's really something different than saying, I think I know what the truth is. The Marx example is a really good one, but liberalism does this too, as a competing ideological structure, that we know what the good way of living is. And we not only know what the good way of living is, we know how to put it into practice. This is where sort of studying the ancients is helpful, because for them, especially let's say for Aristotle, you need to know what the best is. But you also have to understand that the best is almost impossible. It may be impossible. It may only be the best definitionally. You may not ever get there. But if you think that you can, or more accurately, you know that you can, then you sort of become tyrannical. And that's where the word ideology becomes very difficult. Because in the one sense, there's a very technical sense. It's this school of thinking. And I think that's the way you were using it. Please correct me. I think that's the Marxist ideological structure is, insert this. I think another way in which we use it, it means to be someone who is driven tyrannically to the use of power because they know what the truth is, and you're not going to stop them. So when we're talking about Marx, Marx's system is really taking, I don't know how much of a dive you want to go into here.
No, keep going. It's instructive.
So Marx is really taking his big contribution is really twofold, I think. Other people argue with me, but I think sort of we can boil them down to at least two things. So we'll do to him what Jesus does to the 10 Commandments. Boil it down to two and then really to one. But the biggest one is his understanding of dialectical materialism, that everything is driven by material forces, and that this is really what drives class conflict, and that class conflict really drives everything.
In another way, it's you have more things than I do. And because you have more things than I do, or less things, whichever way you look at it, that means that you're going to be in a certain category than me. And then those things will eventually, if they're opposing, are going to collide.
Well, and it's, in a certain sense, yes. But in another sense, it's more, it's broader than that in a certain way, because like the end state of the dialectical materialism is the state of anarchy called communism. So everyone's going to have the same stuff, and it's sort of administered by this sort of amoeba state thing. This is one of my favorite things about reading Marx. He's like, we're going to get there. It's going to be awesome. I don't know what it's going to look like, but we're totally going to get there, y'all. Thank you. Super helpful.
Right.
Really
but it's going to be awesome.
It's going to be awesome. I know it will be. And then by the end of his life, he's like, yeah, I don't know about this, but let's not worry about that. Right. Loud Marx is the important one, but
thousands of pages later, it's like, maybe not.
But the idea is that the way in which, in his language, the means of production, how things are made and distributed within a given system, determines everything about that system. And people that know Marx know that's what he's arguing. Most people that think they know Marx have no idea that they use Marxist thinking 700 times in a day. If your response to something is you're only arguing this because someone is paying you, that's in essence a Marxist critique. It's fundamentally materialist. You're just being paid. Your idea comes from the means of production. You are indebted to the person who's paying you. This is rife. Social science is almost defined by this. It's everywhere, but it's not in this sense ideological. It isn't saying to get to an end state. Instead, it's saying the world is best understood through this language of a dialogue between material goods. I own, you want.
So it's more of like a transactional thing.
And it's also how you organize the entire distribution of your of goods, services, ideas. Love even is dependent upon this in Marx's account. His assessment of like mercantilism, the economic system before capitalism, he sort of reduces it down to what drives this is commodities. So the system is, to be super reductive, commodities, money, commodities. I have things, I sell them to make money so I can buy more things. What capitalism does is it flips that dynamic. You start with money, you make a good, you sell it to make more money. The end state of mercantilism is the acquisition of things. The end state of capitalism is the acquisition of money. And he recognizes that that constant need for acquisition makes capitalism like the most insanely revolutionary economic system ever, because it levels everything. Where the mercantilist structure entrenches aristocracies, and that's why it is the medieval thing. I'm saying this to say that Marx's great contribution in the theory is to almost give what a physicist would call a theory of everything. I can explain all the dynamics here, which is why so many people can grab him and run with him or think they're running with him to explain all the phenomenon they see in the world. Well, Marx is taking it from Hegel. And Hegel's argument is this is really a working out of sort of mind, not really of material goods. And so even Marx by himself isn't like coming onto the fore and making this revolutionary argument in a vacuum. To really understand Marx really requires you to study a bunch of German philosophy. You have to study Hegel, you have to study Kant. And then you have to go, and then you have to go to Rousseau, which means you have to do all the French, which God help you. Then you have to do all the English. And then you have to go back and do all the Greeks. So, you're trapped. It's a forever treadmill. But Marx understood that. Perhaps better than anyone, Nietzsche understood this. But so to go back to your original question, again, I'm sorry, terrible academic answer here.
No, that's okay.
To go back to your original question about what can we call theories or systems of thinking, the big ones are the isms we talk about today, Marxism or socialism, which aren't necessarily the same thing, but for argument's sake, we'll put them together. Liberalism and then conservatism. There are very few actual like ideological conservatives in America. They're like might be 100 of them. They're not here. These are people who are really arguing to go back to a pre-Enlightenment notion of the allocation of government, where you have a sort of unification of church and state. And you're basically being governed according to a ladder of superiority. We could say through a hierarchy, but I think that's misleading because both of the other systems also have hierarchies. But it's really about sort of the ladder of existence to sort of go back to the 4th century, I think he's in the 4th century, church thinker Origen.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what these conservatives are sort of arguing.
Yeah.
The closest manifestation that we have of that in recent time are the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not really combining church and state. They're just making the state church, right? I mean, they're drawing from Christianity so far as it's useful.
Mm-hmm.
But which is sort of why conservative ideas have become associated with fascism.
Yeah.
And that's the big evil boogie. That's Satan, right?
Yeah.
And this isn't quite as prevalent today, but you go back into the 50s and 60s and, being a conservative was dirty. Like you got spit on. Go back and watch the Buckley and Vidal debates. And it's like, it got nasty.
Mm-hmm.
Americans are basically all liberals. They don't know it because we changed that language with the progressives, but we basically everyone thinks that individuals are really important, that you have individual rights, that I'd like to put it this way, that your first name is more important than your last name.
Mm-hmm.
That you as an individual take supremacy, not your family name, your clan name, your tribe. Everybody basically agrees on that. We all like our private property. We may disagree on how much is just, but we all like it. And for the most part, we like the free exchange of ideas and of people and of goods. These are all really fundamental liberal tenets.
Yeah.
So that's another competing theory of life.
Mm-hmm.
Socialism, again, becomes really difficult because you have
there's many factions and subsystems within socialism, which is what it's why that term is really, really, it's a loaded term, but it's just very, you can't just use, it's almost an umbrella term. You can't use that word to describe what you're trying to describe. You have to really break it down.
Yeah, because on the one hand, you get someone like John Stuart Mill, this is the libertarians like go to run to, and at the end of his life, he's calling himself a socialist.
Right.
Because what he means is social reformer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really very popular. And I think that's really how a lot of people that are like under the age of 30 are using that word. They really mean reformer or progressive. They just don't have the language to describe it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas opposed to someone as a scientific socialist, then you're a Marxist, right? And so that's an entirely sort of different thing. Those are really the competing, we could call them theories, we could call them ideologies. I prefer schools. I think that's a more accurate notion because it's compartmentalized. We take from some and from others. And that really, in some ways, if you take certain political philosophy classes, you'll examine these things. Mm-hmm. If you've taken a class in any social science, you're examining it, but you don't really know it. Maybe not in psychology, but certainly in sociology or in economics. History, it's all over the place. So it's why so often when we talk about politics today, or at least this is my assessment of it, we are trapped by the language associated with these structures. And it's why I would encourage anyone that if you're sort of interested in overcoming that, read stuff from before the last 150 years. Go back and read Locke. Go back and read, my preference would be go back to read Aristotle, but go back and read someone that wasn't trapped by the semantic structures that we are today, which makes me sound like a critical theorist.
Well, I was going to say, so we were using Marx as an example, but just give me in terms of, so this is how it's been explained to me. What has been explained to me is that there's a difference between critical race theory and critical theory, and especially its origins in academia. And so, where we get it, where it comes out in the wash is folks like, and not even DeAndre, but folks like Kendi and he's probably the most popular figure. And there's other people as well that are sort of kind of attached to this title, but people in academia would say, yeah, that's not really critical theory. That's just, this kind of, it's kind of like my equivalent of self-help pop psychology is essentially kind of a way of thinking about it. So maybe just explain kind of on again, within this framework or lens of political theory and or ideas, kind of critical theory and all that.
So I put my head here. I I have a passing familiarity with. These are not things I study. I've read them, but I haven't studied them. So
but from the lens of our defined concepts of theory and philosophy and politics. And all.
So where I think that's helpful to go back to the sort of prior discussion on philosophy and where it sort of gets its reset in the 20th century. Now what is it supposed to do? And what emerges in sort of the 30s and the 40s is taking what's called a critical lens, but it's really, the more accurate would be called a deconstructive lens on majority perspectives and the overarching culture. And we get this from people like Adorno and Horkheimer that are sort of laying out the foundation for critical theory, drawing it from Marx, also drawing from Rousseau. And in a certain sense, what they're doing is they're providing, the word I think is best radical. And again, this means to go to the root. It doesn't mean extreme or nutty. It can, right? But it means to go back to the foundation of the tenets. It's an argument based in first principles, we could say, which is why it gets so wrapped up in political philosophy, even if that's not what they're doing. But by its nature, they're having to, because it's engaged in this radical enterprise. So critical theory sort of lays out a way in which you can provide criticism of the overarching perspective or their language cultural hegemony, and deconstruct it down to what usually comes down to a materialist cause. So it's taking a facet of Marx and applying it in other areas. So we could call these people perhaps neo-Marxists. Whether that's an accurate term or not, people are going to argue about this stuff forever. But we could say that that's broadly conceived.
There's at least a shade of Marxism or Marxist thought, and they're using it in whichever way, or they're using that kind of bookshelf or framing to understand other things. Which I would also say that's probably neo-Marxist. People kind of get upset about that because I think, again, maybe because the Marxist label is so loaded now. But sure, I understand what you mean.
Yeah, from the Cold War, right? Because you had to replace the Nazis with something.
Right.
And so you get this sort of use of the dialectical materialism and to apply it in different things. Anybody who's ever used the language of like, we're in late stage capitalism, right? That presumes that it's a stage that's going to end, which means it's an unfurling of history in some form, and it's going to lead to the next stage. Well, you're either Hegelian, you're like a super devout religious person, which means the world's coming to an end, or you're a Marxist and you're kind of laying out, we're coming to the end of a cycle and going on to another one. And most of these people are drawing it not from Hegel, but from Marx. From Marx, yeah. So that's really where I think the classical notions of it come from. Then you get someone like Foucault, and you get like Derrida and Lacan and these sort of French thinkers that are also influenced by Marx. I've read Derrida. Well, let me put it this way. I have done my best to read Derrida and I have done my best to read Foucault. Sometimes I find these guys like trying to sift through concrete. So, but what it sort of lends itself to, broadly conceived, is we can sort of call like another iteration of these sort of critical theorists. And this really lays the foundation for these more recent notions of critical race theory, also sort of broadly conceived the school of feminism. And a lot of this stuff really has its foundation in examining language at its core. So while it still has the materialist drive in a certain sense, instead of examining culture as its own, it's really an examination of linguistics and language, which is why it's so important that philosophy had its big reset at the beginning of the 20th century to reorient all of our sort of higher education to examining language games.
And let me just interject real quick right here, just because I think it might be helpful before you keep going. My reading of it is, so you have, and you made this distinction earlier about, kind of Western thought or Western philosophy, and it gets all the way up to the 20th century and then it changes, right? And many people see Nietzsche as a bridge, right? He was the last philosopher from that era. And mostly because Nietzsche's philosophy is, I view it as a philosophy of life, right? He's trying to disavow kind of these kind of absolute morals and trying to weed out from how religion works and all of these things. But he's also trying to, he has a very good understanding of the Greeks and everyone else before him. And he's trying to find, yes, individualism, but how do you get beyond that? And how do you live life and where you can find value? And again, he was kind of the bridge. I think he's kind of the equivalent in some ways. I've never made this association, but he's kind of like how Beethoven was between the,
no, that's good.
Oh, Jesus. What's the period before Romanticism?
The classical period.
Yes. He's, you can hear early Beethoven is that, and then later Beethoven is the Romantic period. Nietzsche kind of functions that way philosophically. And so I would say then, I mean, I defer to him a lot, but the big giant is Heidegger, and mostly because Heidegger is concerned with ontology, right? He's trying to understand being itself, and he's where he did this in 2027 when Being and Time came out, of where how are you trying to understand basically what it means to exist. But what it means to have the experience of existence. And so then talking about how you have to understand existence for yourself, but then also how other things, other existentials, other things exist, which is different from your being as a human. And so he wraps up temporality and metaphysics within ontology. And that's his genius, is whether you agree with him or not. His genius was trying to understand how everything is with being and the experience of it. So outside of Heidegger, then you get to all the phenomenologists, right? Which Heidegger definitely, I think he fits in there somewhere, but maybe not specifically. But you get people like Merleau-Ponty, you get people like Jean-Paul Sartre, you get people like you get other phenomenologists where they're trying to explain experience. How do we explain the phenomena? And so then, people play around with that. And then after that is where you get to the postmodern deconstructionist, which is basically where they're taking experience and understanding, okay, how do we explain experience? How do we get, again, to the root of things, to the bottom? And they take it further where it says, okay, how do we just break everything down? Literally everything. Just break it. Just how do we deconstruct? How do we just take every single thing of life and we deconstruct it? And if you're Foucault, you say everything's about power. More or less, it's all about power. And so if you take power, I think it's best to kind of look at it as kind of like an onion. You got the core of it is power, and then you move outward from that. And so you have to strip all of the kind of energy power gets, and you just have that. And so then you have it in this way where nobody has power, right? So that we don't want people to do it. And Derrida does a similar notion. He will very easily go back to, okay, well, it's this, and we break it here, with all the experience, with being, with, all metaphysics, the physical world, and see, we just have to have power evenly, or we see power as always tyrannical and it's always a bad thing. We don't want one group of folks to have that, or we don't want that to be over bloated. So when you get to the deconstructionists, and I think you could probably put, what are we at now? Fourth wave feminism? I don't know. Second, third wave feminism starts to go down there. That's where all of this stuff starts to take place. I say all of that because there's a type, it's kind of like art history, right? And I guess maybe music too, is each period is heavily reliant upon the previous period. And then they're trying to they're moving, there's a shift change in how they're thinking about things. And so, Derrida wrote a bunch about Heidegger. Heidegger wrote a bunch about Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote a bunch about Schopenhauer. And then, both Heidegger and Nietzsche wrote a bunch about the Greeks. They obviously mentioned Husserl. They obviously mentioned Hegel. And, and then before Hegel, you have Kant and Descartes. And, you go all the way back. Like everyone's kind of building out from the next kind of group of people. And so I think when you get to postmodern deconstructionism, there's basically nowhere to go anymore, right? There's just no way. And you can throw in Wittgenstein, who's interesting because he's genius, but he's very difficult to really get a handle on. And so this all breaks down to your idea of language, right? So you have experience. So like if you take Lacan, if you take Merleau-Ponty does this a little bit. But a bunch of guys do this. Wittgenstein does it in a different way. I think his biggest claim is, language is seen as visual, right? And how do we understand the puzzles and visual streams? But they're all wondering about, well, language is symbols, they're signs, and they're trying to make sense of an experience you're having. Okay. So when you get to the deconstructionists, they take that even further. And they say, well, it doesn't really mean anything. Well, now we have to understand that language is a type of power it has, right? And it goes as this kind of reductionist argument, in my view, which is, language is just power. So we don't need language. We just got to break it all down, and then we don't need dialogue from that way, because again, it's power, right? And it's always that kind of phase of going to it, and that you can do that. I mean, you can do it logically, I guess. I just don't see why you would do that. And what is, to kind of go to Mill, what is the utility of doing that? So anyways, I cut you off. I wanted to give kind of listeners a kind of overview briefly of 20th century philosophy, and I probably terribly messed it up, but understanding, okay, then when we get to, so where we're at now is critical theory, critical race theory, feminism, certain race theory, certain those things, they're coming out of postmodern deconstructionist thought, which has its, all of the forebears before it is phenomenology, existentialism, rationalism, enlightenment, and everything before that. But it really does have a kind of linking with that, which has, I think, or it can have some, I think, intuitive or instinctive issues with it. But anyways, did I mess all of that up, or how was it?
No, I think that was all really excellent. And I think you have a better understanding of Heidegger than I do, because I have I dabbled in enough of Heidegger to go, I'm going to drown in this man. So I've read him enough, but I think you have a better understanding of him than I do. But I think your account there is there's nothing I disagree with. I think it's a good account. Where I will draw back, I'm more comfortable with Nietzsche. I've spent more time with him, and so where I think your account of sort of things start with Plato and then end with Nietzsche. Nietzsche sort of makes that claim for himself, right? He's like, I'm having a big beef with Socrates, but I'm going to be another one. And everybody was like, yeah, and they ran with it. Like, I don't know if that's true or not. There's plenty of stuff in Nietzsche where he's not telling the truth, and purposely is like being deceptive. But where, what in essence happens is they people read the Genealogy of Morals and think it's a handbook, and it's the most systematic of all of his thinking. Like if you
all of it's aphorisms, but that's the most structured. Yeah. Right.
But if all you've done is picked up Zarathustra and gone through, that wild acid ride of a book, not all of Nietzsche is that, I don't know, pastoral. It's certain, and it's not nearly that poetic. Beyond Good and Evil is, as he puts it, is sort of his way of systematically approaching Zarathustra, which is not helpful. If you've read that book, it's not helpful, because there are so many things in it where you get to it and you go, Nietzsche, what are you talking about? Like, what are these philosophers of the future? What are these supposed to be? We'll figure it out when we get there. What the heck is an Übermensch? Is that the philosopher of the future? What does it mean to transcend man? And man is the thing that has to be overcome. And obviously the associations with the Nazis sort of yikes. I don't think that's fair to Nietzsche, even though his sister is a Nazi, and she sort of does this sort of thing and corrupts him. I don't think that's fair. Walter Kaufman does a whole lot to try to sort of save him in the mid 50s and 60s.
Well, it gets much harder when you're trying to say, well, Heidegger was an actual Nazi, but wait, just hear us out. He has some really good ideas. It's like, exactly. That becomes more difficult.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's, I think about it, I don't know how many of the stories about Aristotle and Alexander the Great are true and how many of them are apocryphal, but let's say that they are true. when Alexander dies and they're like, you taught him and he brought this to us, get out, right? Or you're dead. It's like, oh, how did they do this? You understand how they do this because we would do this. Like,
Right.
there's no way we wouldn't do this. But the point of going back to Nietzsche, and where I think I would say my formal education ends with him. So I've basically been educated from Plato to Nietzsche, and the rest I've read because I've wanted to, but I haven't studied as such, with perhaps the exception of John Rawls. And because Rawls provides a really interesting counterweight to the stuff that sort of the walking out of the European tradition.
Yeah, I mean, his political theory stuff is tremendous. I can't imagine that you don't get that. I mean, he's tremendous.
Yeah, but in a lot of ways, he's a combination of Locke and Kant. And but he really is, and this is where most of our sociology friends or people who are engaging in critical theory haven't read Rawls. They don't know that they're sort of in political state as Rawls. Like it's not really socialism. It's really this kind of New Deal Democrat, sort of an allocation of resources that there can be inequality, but it has to exist for the benefit of the least among you. And it's really a kind of secularizing Christianity through the arm of a progressive government. Yeah. And and if you just heard that, there's a whole lot to unpack there. I know, I'm sorry, but that's really where the state of American liberalism is currently. He's really still the dominant theorist across the board. You just have disagreements to the extent to which we meet Rawls's, conception of fairness, justice is fairness, through his veil of ignorance. Does it require like the sort of a third wave kind of a Democrat, like a Bill Clinton sort of don't overregulate things, but we need to have a big, thick welfare state, but you need to have powerful corporations? Or is it something like Bernie Sanders? Those are not speaking different languages. Those are different dialects they're really talking to each other. And Republicans used to also participate in that. They just had their own dialect. Some of them still do. Other ones are beginning to speak a different language, and which isn't really informed by Rawls. I don't really know what it is informed by. I don't really think that they know what it's informed by, and that's why it's insane. I wrote this little piece back like in 2015 or something about, or it was in 2016, right after Donald Trump was elected, that he's going to be the anarchy president. And I didn't mean that government was going to fall apart. What I mean, again, here etymologically, anarchy means to be without a governing principle. On Arcos, and Arcos was the governor, but really in philosophy, it means like first principle. Yeah. You don't have a governing first principle. It means you're just going to flail around and do the things that come at you as they come at you. In a certain sense, it's just chaos. It's experience, right? Chaos. It's nothingness. Yeah. And sort of the product of that is in essence what we've seen. You just swing at everything because there's no light that you're heading towards.
There's no compass.
Governing principle.
There's
right.
no compass.
And that is a growing element that's developing far more in the political right wing in the Western world than it is in the political left wing. Because
I would say in the uncertain factions of the left, you do have the opposite happening with, people that do hold to critical race theory. It is very much or some form of extreme populism and or progressivism, where it's the opposite, right? It's that compass is wound so tight, I kind of see it as somewhat a little bit on the opposite side of things.
Well, yeah. And I think that what's interesting there, to sort of come back to the reason I lay out that stuff about the American constitutional order, those things are all making different claims on your prioritization and on your affection. Should you love the people more than a person? Should you love the majority more than a political minority? Should you do the opposite? Or should you love the sort of the decisions of the majority more than the expression of an individual? Those are all active, live questions constantly in a form of government like ours that sort of the debate between Rawls and the political philosopher Michael Sandel, who's at Harvard. Rawls lays it out this way. Liberalism has to make a claim on the right, but not the good. So you have the option to do a thing, but we don't tell you what that thing should be. The problem with that, as Sandel sort of notes, that's making a claim on what the good is. The good is the ability to make that individualized choice. That's a claim on the good life. So you're inherently having to make a claim on the good life. It's just one that's kind of empty. And when it doesn't stay empty, human beings like space, sort of, we abhor vacuums in a certain sense. Something will fill in that space. There's going to be an energy that fills it up. There's mass is going to try to come in and fill it, right? We want that equilibrium state. So if you just set up your political arena to only be concerned with questions of the right, and by this meaning access, not the political right, the right of the thing to do it, which is sometimes where I think the self-claimed classical liberal friends or our libertarian friends focus so heavily on that they miss human beings aren't computers. We are going to have to make claims on what the good is. We have to orient our lives toward some good that we are moving toward. Perhaps one of the great things in contemporary political philosophy is how do you reconcile sort of the cosmopolitanism of the liberal principle with the necessary particularism of having a fulfilling private life? Because those are really mutually exclusive things. And we don't have good answers for that. It's a big, big problem, not in just political philosophy, but how do you live that tension?
And this is the interesting thing about this is that, so I can feel I feel the pull of Aristotle. So we'll jump into that. But this is where the phenomenologist would say, yeah, both are fine. You can have both, and you're going to have both, but there's something bigger than that, right? It's experience, right? It's within your being. And it's really hard to really explain that. I think it has merits and has value, and I'm sympathetic to much of that. But I do think it is important to have not a sense of where do you choose, right? Kind of this dichotomy you're painting, but how do you have certain aspects of both that are always pushing and pulling and kind of jostling around within us? I think is important. So let's get into Aristotle. Okay, so this is something that you'll probably know a little bit about. Yeah, a little bit, just a little bit. Yeah, you dabble. Yeah, a little bit. Okay, so give us the 2-minute Reader's Digest biography of Aristotle, just to kind of set the table for us about, refresh our memories from high school or undergrad or whatever about timing, certain kind of political thought, who he was, what he did, and then we can get into his kind of big tenets. And I think probably I just reread the Ethics, but you're looking at more of his politics and what was the other thing that you were
poetics, more rhetoric.
Rhetoric. So
but I deal with a fair deal.
I'm sure you've read the Ethics. So so maybe just set us up for first.
So Aristotle is a 4th century BC thinker, or people call it BCE. It's the same thing. That isn't an Athenian. His father was probably the court physician for Philip of Macedon. Again, that may be apocryphal, but we'll run with it. And this is my saving grace from Aristotle. He goes to study philosophy with Plato in Athens, and he's there for like 20 years. And so I feel better about myself in graduate school. Then there's a bunch of brouhaha, and he ends up not getting to take over Plato's academy. He has to go set up his own thing, and he sets up his own tradition after Plato has died. And he lives in Athens, and in essence engages in what we could say today is empirical work. He's collecting lots of data. His politics is basically written from studying actual constitutions that are sent to him in his school. So he's engaging in a kind of, in the best sense, academic work. And most of the things we have from him are probably lecture notes that were either composed by him or by his students. Some are of higher quality than others. Some have come down to us in better form than others. Aristotle's great certain contribution, in a sense, it depends on how you want to view him. So his teacher is Plato, and Plato's teacher is probably Socrates. And
we'll stay away from the debate on whether Socrates was a real person or all that stuff. But
I think there's enough evidence to say that he was.
I think so too, but people still have that debate.
but I do think it's fair to say that Plato's Socrates may not be the historical one. He may be as much of a literary creation of Plato as anything. I'm not sure to say that he gives a historical account of who the man was. He turns him too much into a superhero for that to be true.
Yeah.
But
and just
which is something we can get into. But
yeah, and just as a side note here, people usually start with Plato or Socrates, but and Plato is obviously huge for the forms and his cave and also he's huge, and Socrates is huge for the Socratic method. All that stuff is tremendous, but there were philosophers, the pre-Socratic or pre-Platonic philosophers, and so this is where you have people like Heraclitus would be one of these guys,
Pythagoras and Thales.
Huge, Pythagoras, all these guys that they have a more, I don't know how you would, I mean, you would know more than I would. I don't know how you would want to cluster them, but they have a certain emphasis on things. I mean, Heraclitus obviously was huge in becoming, but he used his four methods, usually kind of using the elements to try and understand things. And I had a previous podcast with a good friend of mine who, gave an awesome discussion about, Heraclitus for an hour and a half. So I won't go listen to one of the first episode, I think it is actually, about Heraclitus, but
no, that's good. I actually, I was getting there. It's good. This is good. We're on the same wavelength. I was going to get to what Aristotle is sort of doing is following in the Socratic tradition. Cicero says of Socrates that he brought philosophy down from the heavens and introduced it into the life of the city. And by that, what he means is philosophy before Socrates was really interested in natural things and not in human ones. It was attempting to understand the accounts of nature that weren't coming from the gods. So it really was an alternate account of, today we could call it science. It wouldn't be wrong to call them natural philosophers, which is what we call scientists today. What we called scientists in the 19th century is natural philosophers. So that's really what they're engaging in.
You're trying to understand the physical world and how it works. And this could be actual physics, or this could be, social aspects of things, or more environmental things rather. And the physical world is
right. I mean, that's literally the word Greek, physike. Physics means nature. So they're trying to give an account of what nature is. And Socrates, in essence, says, well, they can tell me how these things work, but they can't tell me why it's doing what it's doing. So science really has a hard sort of asymptote to be multidisciplinary here that they can't cross. And so what we have to do is then start examining why we're doing the things that we're doing. He refers to this sort of as his second sailing, because prior to this, Socrates was pre-Socratic, which try translating that sentence into a different language. Good luck. So he sets us on sort of this second path, and which becomes the primary path that almost anyone who has studied political philosophy has been trained in, or if you've taken any class on it, you've swam in this at some point. Aristotle, in a certain sense, provides either the culmination or the first rebuke of the Platonic system. I think it's a little bit of both, but he really is providing a culmination, and the breadth of the things that he writes and leaves down to us essentially establishes the modern academic disciplines. There is a treatise on everything. Now, does that treatise relate one-to-one to what people do in those disciplines today? No. His book on psychology, the Parasuke, on the soul, not really much about what we do in psychology today. Ours is far closer to what he does in the Rhetoric in book 2, which is about understanding like emotions and mindsets and these kinds of things, where for him, the Latin translation of that, deanima, the thing that moves, is a better assessment of what he means by the soul. It's the thing that animates you, because that's what it means in Greek. Like in Homeric Greek, psyche meant like life, breath. So
Homeric Greek is tough.
It is the worst.
It sucks. I've looked at a little bit, just as a side note, I may have mentioned it before. I went to a seminary, and so I took 4 semesters of Koine Greek. I did Greek grammar 1 and 2, and I did Greek exegesis 1. I think I did 2. Maybe I've dropped it. I can't remember. I was like, I'm done with this. So I forgot a lot of it now, but yeah, biblical Greek Koine Greek is kind of from the time, but biblical Greek is a little bit different, or it's a lot different. But Homeric Greek is older, and it's much harder in terms of just how the language works. But mostly, it's such the way the vocabulary and the way the kind of syntax and the way the language and sentences go together it makes sense, but it's just harder. I don't know how to explain it, but I don't know if it's how you see it.
The way that I think about it, or I've explained it, like the difference between Homeric, Attic, and Koine, which really are sort of the big tent poles.
Yeah.
If Koine Greek is modern English, Attic Greek, which is what Plato and Aristotle have been writing in, is something like Hobbes or Locke in terms of time. It's about that far away. Mm-hmm. Homeric Greek is going to be something closer to Shakespeare or Chaucer.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
So it's intelligible to us, but there's a big hurdle there. And when you're learning ancient Greek, which there's a reason why people say it's Greek to me, and so at best you're learning it like the 3rd or 4th grade level, unless you get really advanced, ask a 3rd grader to go back and read Chaucer, and that's how well we're going to be able to tackle Homeric Greek. So, right. But the sort of the point on the suke, what Aristotle was laying out there is, this is the thing that's the motivating, and that really sort of lays into his whole conception of physics, which is not miles from what we do today in physics, but it's certainly different instruments. Like that's the whole point of the Enlightenment, is the overturning of Aristotle. Right. And so to get back to this is only 2 minutes, I promise, biography of Aristotle.
Oh, it's good. It's good.
When Alexander dies, Alexander the Great, after Philip conquers all the Greeks,
right,
and then dies, probably assassinated by a Persian, maybe a Greek, but we'll go with the Persian. It's sexier. Alexander says, I'm going to finish his work and I'm going to go and conquer. And, he gets all the way to India and then is probably killed by one of his lieutenants. Or dies from natural causes, but we'll go with him being poisoned. Again, it's much sexier. It's the ancient world. Everybody was getting killed by everybody.
Yeah. If anyone's read the histories by
well, Herodotus has one.
Yes, Herodotus. That's what I'm thinking of. It is, man. It literally is like reading a 300 movie. I mean, it's wild.
Livy. If they want a sequel to Game of Thrones, they just need to make Livy into a series. Like these Romans are nuts.
Yeah,
terrific.
It's wild.
Or you can read Machiavelli's version of it, which distorts it, makes it even sexier because these people are bananas. But anyway, so when this all goes down, Socrates is killed by the Athenians in 399. He is brought up on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. And Plato's apology, which means the defense speech, that's what apology means in Greek, is an attempt in a certain sense to both provide a defense of Socrates, but also in a certain way a defense of the Socratic way of life, of philosophy, of political philosophy.
Yeah.
So Socrates is found guilty by a narrow margin. And which he then, in Greek style, you get to propose what your punishment should be, and then your accuser gets to. And Socrates is like, you need to throw me a big party and parade for everything I've done from the city. And the prosecutors are like, we're going to kill you. And so they vote to kill him. And, so this sort of ends the end of his life. And he drinks the hemlock very famously and all this kind of stuff. Aristotle, this may be again apocryphal, but Aristotle says of this that Athens sinned against philosophy. And that when Alexander dies, there's a great deal of anti-Macedonian sentiment that goes across the Greek world, but in particular, it hits Athens where he is housed. And in 323 or 322, depending on what calendar you're using, Aristotle is driven out from the city. And by all accounts, he dies from dysentery, which to me is one of the, he's in his late 60s. I don't even think he was 70. And which is one of the saddest comments to me that I can think of, one of the most brilliant minds to be produced in the ancient world, perhaps in any period of time ever in Aristotle. And he dies from eating bad fruit. It's like, wild. it makes you really appreciate the fact that not only can we have a conversation in real time connecting to the stars and back to each other,
Right.
but we don't have the problem frequently with dying from bad fruit.
It's kind of like it's kind of like that weird thing where it was like, not the same. I'm not comparing Aristotle to this guy, but it's like when Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, this guy was literally putting his head in alligators' mouths. Like he was doing wild stuff, taking king cobras, by the throat, just doing crazy things with wild animals. And he gets stung by a stingray and just
in the chest, and it kills him. Yep.
And just right in the chest. It's like one out of however many. It's so rare. I think it's like you could get hit by lightning before that happens or something. It was so rare. That's how the guy dies. And he dies at what, 40 something? I mean, it was just crazy.
It makes me appreciate in Aristotle's discussion of happiness and the ethics. This is one of those great biases that modern audiences have, because whether people are practicing Christians, most people are acting in a Christian ethic. They don't really they don't really like the idea of fortune, and especially bad fortune. Mm-hmm. And Aristotle is pretty clear that you really can't call someone who is happy or, eudaimonia, it has happiness, or blessedness, or however people want to translate this, because they are still subject to the whims of fortune, as he himself was. Right. He uses Priam as his example. Who would ever say, the king of the Trojans? This man had done everything correctly, devoted his life to his city. He had raised his kids. They were great. Of course, one of them's a little ass and goes off and starts this whole war. What are you going to do? But he's dedicated everything he can. And then he has to live long enough to watch everything he cares about be destroyed in front of him. Who could ever say this man is blessed? Right. Even though at certain points in his life, you would have to say he was the most happy person you could be. Aristotle himself, perhaps we have to apply the same thing. Here's my Nietzsche sliding in, that these are really just philosophers are really just attempting to put their perspective of the world onto the world. Mm-hmm. So when Aristotle dies, his school gets taken over, and we don't have much writings from there. But at that point, it sort of becomes a bit more obscure, and then the Romans come in and conquer, and Aristotle gets assimilated into sort of a pantheon of the great intellects of the Greeks. Mm-hmm. And this becomes a great concern for the Romans, because this is how you differentiated yourselves from the rabble. Right. You got a Greek slave that taught you Greek and taught you philosophy and literature. And he becomes so influential that by the medieval period, he's just referred to as the philosopher. Mm-hmm. And he becomes the cornerstone, in a certain sense, of the Christian understanding of the world through Thomas Aquinas, of applying Aristotelian notions with Christian ethics. Yeah. Because they didn't really have the politics and the ethics. Those were still in the Muslim world, but they weren't really in Christendom for a long time. Until you get to Thomas Aquinas, so 1,000 years later. Mm-hmm. By the time we get to the Enlightenment, like the Renaissance, so the restoration of the Greeks, literally what the rebirth is, the reintroduction of Plato and Aristotle, plus the artistic sensibilities of the Greeks and the Romans. But we could say that the Enlightenment's project is purposely the overturning of Aristotle. Bacon is doing this. His new organism, the novum organum, right? The new method of science is literally named after Aristotle's book on methodology, the organon, right? The method. No, Aristotle was wrong. We've got to replace him with a new one. And this becomes, in a certain sense, the project of modern science is the repudiation of Aristotle, which is why it's very infrequently you'll find someone that does the natural sciences that has nice things to say about Aristotle, because a lot of his science was wrong. Mm-hmm. But it's also because of the sort of the barbarism of his age. He didn't have the ability, if he had a microscope, he would have found the moons too, like Galileo, he would have, so in a certain sense, the modern project has been to sort of overturn or reject notions of Aristotle. And that's true in political theory. It's true in ethics and across the sort of thing. But anytime you're engaged in the refutation of someone, it also requires a certain affirmation, because you have to say they're important enough to refute. So we continue to have to study Aristotle, even those who want to refute him, to know what is worthy of being refuted. And so sort of backhand, you continue to preserve his relevance. And that's not why I think you should study him. I think he's relevant on his own accord. And I think there's value in him on his own. But we're never going to be able to escape him. And because we can't ever escape him, we're not ever really going to be able to escape his teacher either. And so there's my 2-minute biography.
No, it's really good. It's really, really good. I appreciate that. It's really good. Okay. So let's do this. I think probably with the rest of the time that we have, and this should be probably, cakewalk for you. Tell us, so give us, I guess, and you can just use your research that you've been doing. A lot of people know, some portion of what you had just said. Like I said, they remembered it from, somewhere that they've learned about Aristotle in some place, or, maybe they've read Aristotle themselves. And so, I think, again, if you look up, just, Wikipedia page or something, you can find enough of the like basic stuff about Aristotle. So I want to maximize your brain here and tell us all the inside stuff that you've spent 4 or 5 years studying about Aristotle and kind of your angle and how, just some of the nitty gritty concepts and details that you're concerned about with him.
Okay, sure. We may have to go well over our time limit then.
I'll keep pace, but you just go and I'll keep pace.
So I'm going to start, if this is okay, I'm going to start at like the 10,000 foot level, and then we'll get down into the sand. So what I was first interested in, and again, this sort of comes from what I now understand was the path that was set for me when I was an undergraduate. Of course, I didn't know it then, but it was sort of the path set for me. We spent a bunch of time studying the tragedians, so Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, and then we spent a time with Homer, and then we spent a bunch of time with the Bible, and which everybody's like, this is weird. I thought you were doing political philosophy. Well, these are the texts that the thinkers use to communicate with each other. And so if you really want to go through and understand Locke, you better have your Bible with you, because the man's using it all over the place. And in a lot of places, he's using it in a way that's subversive. He's using the text to undermine the arguments in the text. That's not unique to him. That's all over Plato and Aristotle. But they expect you to know your Homer really well and to know the rest of the tragedians really well. So I spent a bunch of time reading them and attempting to understand as much as I can their nature and their arguments. But then I got to thinking about, why don't we have this sort of shared endeavor today? And that's what led me to reading a lot of the 20th century stuff, again, the sort of on a train, so to speak, the passing way, the ideas of deconstruction and sort of ultimately, and I don't want to use this word as a pejorative, but it is a pejorative, the solipsism that emerges from the 20th century, which may actually be the goal of a lot of 20th century philosophy. But what that solipsism fails to understand is that, and this is something Nietzsche did understand, that if you're going to argue for a notion of individual supremacy, it also means being alone, being responsible for being in isolation. Well, people don't like that.
Right.
No, it's I want to be alone with everybody else. No, that doesn't really work. Kant refers to this as sort of the unsocial sociability of human beings. And
that sounds very much like him.
Right. Again, and I'm sure it's better in German, because in English it's like, what the hell does that mean?
No, it's like,
But so where it sort of led me to, why don't we have a sort of an overarching language that we can use to talk to each other about the phenomenon as we're experiencing them? And because we don't have a Homer, we don't have a Bible, and we have the Bible, but it's not the universal text through which we communicate anymore. It is for some people, but it's not the overarching structure. We don't really have one. But then I got to thinking, but we do. And it's all of the various iterations of popular culture that have come in to fill in those gaps, where in essence, we are using, I think about this in terms of like postmodernism. There isn't really postmodern music. There's modern music, which is like, John Cage and these kinds of guys, where it's repeated arpeggios that goes on for 47 minutes and, this kind of stuff. You
don't love that?
Not really. Or you get the other ones who write half the group in like the key of B flat and then another one in the key of A, and you're like, I hate you people. So this is sort of after you get through Stravinsky, and then it sort of gets even more so as you go along the 20th century. But postmodernism is in essence a schema for criticism, not for creation.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. That is a great way to put it.
So when you get to, thank you. And when you get to, so how do you create music out of criticism? It doesn't really work. And that's why in a certain sense, what is postmodern art, except for the sort of an application of things that came before it through a critical lens. It's really art through the lens of an academic. How artistic is that? Also, how much is that really involved in sort of the Enlightenment or post-Enlightenment project, the Romantic project of doing art for its own sake? If you're engaging in criticism of the art before you make the art, you're not doing it for its own sake. You fundamentally corrupted the entire enterprise. That's sort of something else. But so that got me to thinking about if this is really the milieu that we're sort of swimming in. But we have all of these things that we're all participating in. I like going back and watching old like TV and movies like from the 40 and the 50s, sort of in its nascent period, even into the 60s and 70s somewhat. They're making references to Superman. This is a character that's really old, but he's so well known that it's already disseminated. And I don't have to say anything other than the name, and it conjures in your mind what that is, what it looks like, the characteristics that are associated. You can make expectations of how this person should act. And when they don't, and the movie doesn't follow your expectations, you get pissed, right? And then you're a nerd and everybody loves you, right?
It's how I try to explain to people why Hitchcock is such an important figure. You can love or hate his work, but everybody copies him.
Right.
I mean, just everyone knows that you're just ripping off of him, or it's just everybody in film. If you go to film school, you go to a movie theater. I mean, not now, but when you go to a movie theater, you're going to see Hitchcock in every other movie, something.
And it's the same thing with Akira Kurosawa, right?
Yes.
And we have these people. I mean, Orson Welles, in a certain sense, also does this stuff. They had the benefit that no one had already done it. A lot of their techniques get, sort of, and that's sort of path dependency. Here's our social science coming back to us, right? Once something is set up, you don't really break from it.
Yeah.
But we've, in a certain sense, one of the things that Adorno and Horkheimer sort of lay out is, we've commodified everything, and it's really made everything, in the most snide way, bourgeois, and which. That's a funny word to me. I'll go on a slight tangent here, but it's a funny word that people use, bougie, which that word makes me want to brush my tongue. Right. Because to me, bourgeois means to come, it's the French version of the English word burgher. And a burgher was a town dweller, which meant you were a merchant. It literally means to be part of the middle class. So anybody who's like mocking someone for being bourgeois, it's, oh my God, how dare you be sort of middle class? No, that's what we want. Like, you don't want someone who has so much leisure that they can, just snort cocaine all day long. Right. And you also don't want someone who is so crushed by their debts and have no ability to live that they're in essence a slave to their condition. You want someone in the middling sort. Right. How Aristotelian of me. And as I got to thinking about it more and more, I kept thinking, if I'm coming to these conclusions without reading Aristotle, I'd read him in undergrad. And I sort of liked him, and I was like, okay. And I appreciated some of this stuff. But I never really spent time with him, if you know what I mean. And I think, when I get to graduate school and I started thinking about this and going through it, I said, why don't I go back to Aristotle and see what he has to say about the relationship between the popular culture of the time and his political understanding of how things work. Why is he so frequently using the tragedians and Homer, who serve both the role of religious text, as if you could say there is such a thing in the Homeric world, which is, I don't think is actually accurate, but it's the closest we can say. Because they don't really worship Homer, but he's giving an account of what is a better way of saying it. But the tragedians are taking those stories and sort of reconstructing them and using them for their own purposes. He understands that. and they're doing something that's inherently political. And so I got to thinking about, well, if that's the case, Aristotle has a book on the Poetics. Why don't I read this? And as I get to going through and reading it, I start seeing, oh, he's attaching this idea to this over here. And he's doing this with this in the Ethics. And he's using these specific emotions, and he talks about them politically in the rhetoric over here. There's a system that's being developed here in the way that we are supposed to understand the use of art, not making art, but the use of art politically and ethically. And a lot of people have done this before me. It wasn't something like a new revelation that I'm breaking new ground or I'm getting to the moon for the first time or something. But what a lot of people, I think, in the literature don't necessarily do is they read Aristotle as too much like, to do a callback to our very beginning, through a kind of conservative ideological lens. Combining church and state into a single entity, and that you need to have devout piety to the state, and these kinds of things, and that the purpose of art, and this was really true in the medieval period, was to make you harden you to ethical quandaries. And that's the sort of the first use of the word catharsis, is a purging, and that's true. I mean, all the way up through Nietzsche, even in Freud. If Freud sort of reads Nietzsche and then like Freuds him up, and but he's really responding to Aristotle, and in this attempt to understand what it means to be cathartic. And so as I'm sort of swimming through this in the early part of my of grad school, I got to thinking, our popular culture is doing all of this for us, but we're spending so much time arguing about how do we destroy the majority culture. And I don't mean like in a given place. I mean anywhere, anything that is dominant. Like that's really what deconstructionism is sort of getting at. That's why your conversation about power was so important, because power, for some reason, this again tells us a lot about their thinking. They're so averse to power because they know they would use it poorly.
I would say even in a different way is that you're only viewing power as, I mean, it's not even reductionistic. It's just, it's fucking wrong is what it is. It's so parochial. It's so frustrating. Is you're basically assigning inherent to what it is power as a negative. You're assigning power as only this way of being, but this only one way of acting, as evil, tyrannical, and power has so many ways that it can be. It's not just this one negative way. It can be that way. And many times it is that way, but it's not the only way it's that way. And that's the biggest problem, is at bottom, the biggest critique, the essential critique with postmodernists and deconstructionists is, okay, why do you view power that way? You can view power in a bunch of ways. Why are you choosing to view it that way? You can do everything you're doing, but you're making a choice of a source to see power as in a very single-minded way. And I think that's the biggest thing.
Well, and to go even further, I think that's right. I mean, that's using postmodernism on itself, which is applaud that. That's always good, right? That gives you the sort of the Thrasymachus blushing moment. Like,
listen,
you make this argument. And
there was a way in which I got out of seminary and religion, and I went from theist to atheist, and it was not the Richard Dawkins route. It was within its own system against itself. So. Yeah.
So, but of course, then there's the other side of it, is even laying out the interpretation. Why is the default that it's corrupting? It's because at the underscore, you're still a liberal at heart. Right. And what you really are is you're a liberal Calvinist.
Yes. Absolutely.
And you just haven't read any of these people, right? Because you're too busy deconstructing them to understand that they're sort of, your daddy or whatever. But the especially that sort of notion of the human beings are fundamentally depraved and corrupt, and if you give them power, they're going to do this kind of stuff. Like, you have to believe in original sin for that to be true. This is not something that like the Greeks thought of. You were not inherently either. You were molded. You could be both, and everyone is both. And the best thing that you can do is try to maximize the things that are beneficial, minimize the things that are harmful, but recognizing you're going to make mistakes. And the best all education really is an attempt to fail better next time. Right. And that's really, and as I got to read more in Aristotle, I got to think, I think more in that way of Aristotle as a teacher and less as I don't know, in the sense, someone who is professing. Here's a pathway that we can lay out and think about these things and attempt to try to integrate them as much as possible, very much understanding that human beings are limited in their reason. We are deeply swayed by our desires. He says in the Politics that, without law, human beings are the worst creatures when it comes to food and sex, because we'll kill our own in order to get what we want. Like we are the most barbaric of all the animals.
Right.
Our critical theory friends fundamentally reject that because they go back to Rousseau, and Rousseau's like, no, human beings are the most docile, wonderful creatures ever. And I'm like, dude, have you ever met one? Like,
well, right. It's that. And it's also, I mean, just look at the power of evolution and what that tells us. There's nothing docile about us or any other organism that's trying to survive and live on the planet.
Right. That's right. And that's one of Nietzsche's great criticisms of Darwin.
Yes.
Right. That Darwinism doesn't lead to excellence. It leads to mediocrity.
Yes.
Because the excellent things are the ones you kill. And which is a big problem for people who try to use Nietzsche to justify this kind of, quasi-Darwinian evolutionary development kind of stuff. And they're like, no. You're not just getting him wrong. You're doing the exact opposite of what he's saying.
Yes.
So as I was getting
or it's like how people try and use Nietzsche to try and somehow give some secular form of Christianity. I won't name particular names, but that's also absolute, heresy and blasphemy against Nietzsche. So
yeah, your fishing line isn't going to have to be very long for that one. Got to bite very quick. Yeah. So I've been trained as, and was a really controversial figure for a while. I mean, he still is in some circles, but not a lot. Most of my training comes downstream from a guy named Leo Strauss. And, so being a Straussian, right. And which mostly is a very particular way of reading Plato, or people think that's true. And it's not true, but that's how he's caricatured. And, but the joke is among Straussians is that you find the secret atheist among those who say they believe in God, and you find the secret theist among those who say they're atheists, right?
Very funny.
And Nietzsche is the classic example, right?
Yeah.
And I don't I don't try to do those games. I'm not good at them, so I don't try. But what I can say, or I think I can say anyway, in Aristotle, is that Aristotle's attempt to provide an account of how human beings should live. And the word should there is doing a lot of heavy lifting, not do, right? But should. Has to incorporate the various things that we participate in as we live together. And one of the natural consequences of that is how we spend our leisure time. Because if all you did was work every day, all day long, and you didn't have any free time, you can't be a citizen because you can't participate in anything but the sort of the drudgery of being alive. And you don't have the ability to, engage with the gods. You don't have free time. How do you praise or give worship? You also don't have any ability to enjoy any of those other things that human beings seem hardwired to enjoy, like music, like dancing, like art, like storytelling.
The life of the aesthete, right? The person that's looking at some of the aesthetic pleasures, right? How do you understand that? Yeah,
that's right. And I mean, the word aesthetic means to experience. And so if you're sort of like living an anesthetized, an unexperienced life, right? What are you if nothing but a slave to your condition? And by this, doesn't mean it shouldn't, I hope it doesn't invoke the image of like American chattel slavery. What I mean is someone who's fundamentally dependent and cannot ever stop being so. Yeah. And so if you're going to live a condition that's not that, you have to have a certain amount of free time. And sort of as a sort of fun Jeopardy note for anybody listening, the word free time comes from the Greek skole, which is the root of the word school, and scholar. So if you want to, we spend a lot of time giving people a whole lot of free time until they're, 18, 22, 25, whatever. And to like learn and do stuff. And what do we spend it doing? Drinking and having sex with each other. Just as Aristotle intended. So if you have this free time, if there's everything, the other part of Aristotle that always has resonated with me, which again is very counter to the way modern people think. If something exists, it exists for a purpose. It doesn't exist accidentally for Aristotle. And this is why reconciling him with Darwin is so difficult.
Yes, absolutely.
Because there isn't really the idea of like evolution as a chaotic unfurling through time. It was really problematic to use a loaded word, for Aristotle. So instead, if we invert it and say this thing exists because it serves a function, which I think modern biologists are doing to a certain degree. They're sort of post hoc after evolution, saying this exists for this reason, which is kind of a backward form of teleology. But if we say this exists for a purpose, and that's true sort of biologically, it's also going to be true politically or ethically. These behaviors exist for a particular reason. Some things exist only because they're bad. And he's very clear that in the ethics. There's no like virtue of murder. That's just an inherent vice. But there are these other ones, and he lays them out, the 11 virtues, and you have an excess and a deficiency. And this is the classic part that people get taught from Aristotle, like books 2 through 5 in the ethics. Like courage, moderation, liberality, magnanimity, justice, this kind of stuff. But there are all those other books that surround that stuff. Right.
Books 7, 8, 9.
Right. And then you get to book 10 and it's like getting hit in the head with a 2x4 because he's like, well, we got to start everything over now. And you're like, no, screw off, Aristotle. But the sort of what I'm getting at, if each one of these things has a function and there's an excess and a deficiency, and he's sort of laying it out, there's a purpose that's behind all of these things. Leisure has to exist in a certain sense as part of living together. That has to be one of the benefits of associating that we don't get just by living a day in, day out sort of animal life where you just go get food, sleep. Because we could do that and we could meet all of our needs to survive, but that wouldn't be a human life. And so there's something about a human life that pulls us outside of just those basic necessities. And eventually it draws us into political association with each other. One of those things has to be being able to live beyond those base needs. And part of that is leisure. Well, so if leisure is part and parcel of living together politically, and politics is aimed at a particular end, leisure has to be aimed at a particular end. And he lays this sort of out in Politics, Book 8, about what's the purpose of a music education. And music education is really the education of our leisure time. And there, music is included in our word music, the transliteration, but it really means to be the thing of the muses. And they're the 9 sort of ancient muses, dancing and history and singing and this kind of stuff. So what we could say more accurately would be a cultural education. What's the purpose of being educated in culture? So for us would be the humanities. Why do you need an education in the humanities? I can't imagine why that would ever be a relevant question for people to ask at university. But, Aristotle gives us a reason.
Right.
and the reason is so that you can have a mind that is free from always being in drudgery. It gives you the opportunity to live in a way that appreciates your free time, where it isn't, what's that awful song from the 80s? Everybody's working for the weekend.
Oh God. Yeah. Is that one of those one-hit wonders?
Yeah. And now to all of you that have it stuck in your head, you're welcome. And I'm sorry. But that's sort of the point of that song is that the purpose of work is free time, right? Everybody wants leisure. That's sort of
work hard, play harder, that whole thing.
Right. But what that really does is sort of getting at, because leisure could mean the absence of work, which is in some ways the way we treat it now. You work really hard, you do all the things, and you go home and you watch TV and veg. You get up and do the same thing. It's on infinitum. Then you retire and you walk around for 10 or 15 years and then you die, right?
But that would be idleness, though, if it's the absence of work.
Correct. And that's exactly what he concludes, right? This is a kind of a vice. So that's telling us that if there's a vice to leisure, then there has to be a virtue to it, following the same logic laid out in the ethics. And ultimately, that education, well, it could be about becoming an expert. And this is a passage, Aristotle is notorious in the Greek for being super compressed and condensed. because some of the texts don't come down to us. The Poetics is a good example of this. We're missing over half of the thing. So all of our conclusions on it have to be truncated a bit because there are pieces missing.
Right.
But again, since it's mostly notes, in the same way that you write notes, it's compressed. You understand what it is. Your students may understand what it is, but then you have to translate those notes into another language, like God be with you. And the Poetics is a classic example of this. But there's this passage where he's talking about there can be an excess of knowledge. And of course, since it's only like academics that read this, of course, it's hair on fire. He can't possibly mean this, right? This is nuts. But what he's getting at, or to my reading of it anyway, is that you can have an excess that goes beyond the virtue of leisure. Not that you can have excess knowledge as like a philosopher, but that's a different kind of virtue. It's a different kind of activity. Instead, what do we really need people to have leisure to do? And it's really to have discernment about what is noble in its nature and not. And of course, when people apply this, again, that sort of conservative notion, and here I can even mean American conservative, where it's like 1950s Leave It to Beaver, sort of this is the best kind of stuff, right?
Right.
When you apply it, the only thing you should ever do is spend your day reading and listening to Beethoven, right? Anything else, it's drugs and rock and roll and all these damn kids and there's ZZ Top and stuff, right?
Right.
How dated is that reference? But anyway, so it's this kind of stuff. They're all out here. They're all on the TikTok and they're all, whatever. And but I don't think that's what he's getting at. I think what he's saying is what you have to be able to do is recognize when something is beautiful. And we need people to be able to recognize when something has beauty and when something doesn't. And the way that you can sort of try to construct that is in the rest of the Poetics. How do we go about critiquing the things that we experience aesthetically, right? And here through the means of poetry.
Right.
And he lays out a whole system on what things are appropriate kinds of criticisms and which ones aren't. And the point there is to sort of say, this is how you can orient as an audience member, not as someone making it. Basically that he kind of attributes to, you have to have a kind of spark of madness, so to speak. You have to be inspired to do these. Most people who make compelling stories can't tell you why. I think that's true of most people you talk to. Why was this music so compelling? Well, I heard it and I liked it, but it's not rational. I don't say, I did a 4 chord and then I went and did a 7 and then I went through this leading tone and it brought me back to home and I really like this stuff. They don't think that way. Or if they do, it's not really that enjoyable to listen to. You get modernist music, right?
So let me give an example of something that is an example of this. So I've liked heavy metal music I like all types of music, but heavy metal is home, right? I love all that stuff. Classics are cool, but really more of the modern stuff is just where I'm at. And as I've gotten older, I really like prog metal. That's really kind of, and I do like the classics for prog metal. And one of my favorite bands is Between the Buried and Me. They're kind of a modern contemporary progressive metal band that is fusing many, many, many different styles. They're very entrenched in the history of, kind of prog rock. And, but it's, harsh vocals, pretty aggressive. And, there's an evolution to their history and stuff. And anytime I introduce people to this band, I'll say, this is my favorite band and here's all the reasons why. And I'll say, but this is how I think about music. Like this gets me, right? When I think about music, that's exact, but it's not. And so most people, when they hear it, it's, different chord progressions. It's different keys. It's definitely different time signatures. You're doing different phases of music. You're doing different themes of music. Songs are 12 minutes long. Like it's a journey. Like it's all these things. And most people, and usually it's very technical, right? But it's not just technical. And so when I show people for, the first time, or if they get a new album that comes out, I will, torture my family, and they'll be like, "Oh God, please, we can't." And it's one of those things where it's like objectively you could explain everything they're doing musically, which is tremendous. But then there is an emotional side of things, right? Where it's like, whoa, like that connects with me, or I have a feeling about that when I hear this part, or that, again, certain chord projection, or there's a certain, you're doing it in a D minor or something like that. But then there's like the experience of it, right? Where people can't really explain what it is that clicks or what it is that makes sense for people, right? And so for me, my brain is it's hardwired to just think very abstractly and in all different themes, and to think just in general. And they just do that musically. So to me, it like connects and immediately clicks and it makes sense. And so, you can do, I'm just using myself as an example, but you could do this with anybody, right? When someone's like, I don't know why I like it. I just like it. I just do. Right. Or I can't explain why I like it, but I just do. Is this similar to what you're saying?
Well, so that's a bit more experiential, a bit perhaps more like a phenomenon.
Yes. Yes.
Than necessarily what Aristotle, but because what Aristotle is really laying out is not how the individual experiences it, but rather what the purpose of the experience is.
Okay, parse that out.
And so, like, he lays out, we don't have a whole lot of notation from ancient Greek music. They wrote it down. We have some, but not very much. And there's actually one on YouTube. If you guys, anybody who's listening hasn't checked this out, I really want you should go to it. Look up AULOS, Aulos. And they've been able to reconstruct some of that music. You can find it on YouTube. I think it's from King's College at Oxford, has done this a couple years ago. And you can just listen to the stuff that they, as close as an approximation as we're going to get currently to what it was. And it's fascinating because you can hear, like when the Aulos is playing, you can very much hear Western tonality, like the circle of fourths and fifths for music theory people. You can hear some of that in it, but then you can also hear like the Islamic call to prayer in it. And you can hear like, it sounds very European and very Mediterranean, so to speak, simultaneously.
That's super cool.
Plato says it's the instrument that causes you to go insane. And I think it's amazing. I love listening to it. My wife hates it completely. It sounds like noise, because it sounds like somewhere, if you were to fuse these three instruments, a bagpipe, a clarinet, and an oboe, and which I find to be, it's beautiful. And she's like, it's nails on a chalkboard. So, okay. Plato got one of us right. But they don't have the notation, but we do have the names and the modes, and the mode names came down to us. So anybody that's like learned scales, you've learned the Lydian mode, the Mixolydian, the Dorian. These are all named after dialects of ancient Greek. They were also the modes, the name of the modes of the music. And Aristotle really breaks it down that there are two, but three. And it sort of, you have the Dorian, which is sort of military whip your ass music, I think is the best workout music, like the stuff that pumps you up,
get you pumped. Yeah.
Then you have sort of the Lydian, which is the best way he describes it is dirge music, like funeral stuff. But I think that it goes beyond just that, but it's the kind of music that is mostly written in minor keys. And then you have something that's like the mixed Lydian. So it sits somewhere between them, somewhere between pumps you up and makes you cry. And I would say that almost all of our music now sits in that pocket. We don't have, especially pop music, we don't really have a lot of the sad stuff. Some, but even the sad stuff's like, you're going to get over it. You're going to make it better. Things are going to get on, you're going to move on. Very little of it is like, everything's terrible. You're going to die. It's all meaningless, sort of nihilism.
Right.
That's not very popular. I'm sure it exists, but it's not, it's not going to hit the number one on the charts.
So you're saying that these kind of modes, if you will, were purposeful. There was a purpose of creating this or forming this for a particular experience, as opposed to what's your experience of this. That
it can be used purposefully. That these things resonate with parts of our soul. And that really is sort of the underlying point. Why do we have a music education? Because when you listen to music, it changes the state of your soul. It actually changes the way in which you think and act. And a lot of the science that's been done on this recently, we've hooked up the diodes and brain scans and this kind of stuff. That's true. He didn't have MRIs, but somehow people in the 4th century were doing the same stuff we are. And so I tried to think about, what is this song doing? And what is it supposed to be making me feel? And so that's part of the ways we can critique it. And and how successful is it in completing that feeling? And that really is the beauty that's part of it. And I think that's like the opening line of the Poetics lays out, the Greek is better than most English translations, but it lays out that there's a beauty that is contained within the construction is the closest translation. And even better would be, how well is it beautifully put together? And because the beauty is in the piecing together or the way the elements interact with one another, it's not inherent to the content. Because the content really is more specific to the category of thing you're assessing. Because a comedy is going to have a different kind of construction than a tragedy. Yes. Just in the same way that pump you up, whoop you ass music is going to have a different kind of construction than everything is meaningless and nihilism stuff. So confusing those things.
Sorry, is it the? I'm trying to unpack this. Is it the structure of it that is having the purpose? Because I immediately begin to think of author's intent, right? Well, someone created this and there's a purpose, right? Like if I write you an email, there's a purpose with my email, typically, whether I know it or I don't know it, there's still a purpose. But so in terms of like the structures of things, there's a purpose, or is it even, or is it the specific details within the structure, or is it both that have the purpose?
Sure, good. So I think the way that I read it is that the purpose is in the how does this thing, this medium by which I'm working, result in the outcome that I want. So if my job as a tragedian is how do I tell a story that's going to arouse the emotions that are attached to tragedies? And so I should make a note there. Tragedies don't mean sad. They do for us, it come down to us, but tragedy is a form. And the word literally means like the song of the goat or the song for the goat. The Greek is corrupted. So either it means that, that may have been the award that people won at these contests. You could win a goat, like, what does Sophocles have a use for a goat, but whatever, but it could be where it came from. We don't know. There's debate in the literature on that, but it's the kind of form. It would be better to say, I went and saw a drama or a play last night than saying I went and saw a tragedy, because a tragedy in our minds makes the box too small, because it's really referring to a form, a style of storytelling. And comedies in some ways are the inverse of that, follows similar beats, but it really is a different kind of construction, especially for him. We've sort of leveled out those things a bit more now and are more content specific than structural. So you can't do an A to A.
Yeah. That's particularly helpful. Do we have anything? And if so, give me an example. You could do a film or something, but like, what's a kind of structure of a tragedy we have in the current?
I think the closest is Hamilton, Lin-Manuel's Hamilton.
Okay.
And by that, I mean, like the ancient tragedies, if anybody's ever, you read them sometimes, which is, you get the experience. That's one of the things Aristotle says, that you can get the experience of a tragedy from hearing it, or in our sense, from reading it. Watching it's a different thing, especially the way that they would have seen it, instead of a modern sort of like with modern stuff, but with the black cloak, with the mask, where just the bottom of the mouth moved, very creepy. If you've never, it's very creepy, but you don't know who the characters are by visual cues. You only know them through their speech. And so in a certain sense, they're more rational than ours are, if that makes sense, because they're fully dependent on the speech.
So how is Hamilton a tragedy? So
Hamilton obviously doesn't do that. Hamilton instead follows, in a certain sense, the pattern of the end of the character, how they end at the end of the story, right? Their death or their triumph or whatever is intelligible from the beginning. And this is the part where I spend a lot of my time in my dissertation, sort of walking through why I think that this is the correct structure. That tragedies, fundamentally, to be effective, have to be intelligible. If Hamilton ended by him going, I'm going to go fight Aaron Burr, and on the way a comet landed on him, right? That's not, there's no emotional release there. You're just going to go, what the hell, right? This is stupid. I hate this kind of stuff. Because in a certain sense, this comes back to our conversation of fortune. You can't have fortune really be the underlying cause in a story. because it won't arouse and release the emotions correctly. Because they don't for you anyway, right? Sort of fortune is something we're always afraid of. And fear is the most overwhelming sort of emotion. It cancels everything else out if you have too much of it. It even gets to the point to where it can overwhelm you entirely. Like you completely lose your sense of self. And it's sort of Aristotle's account. I think it's true. And that you can whip audiences up into a frenzy and make them so afraid that they'll just go out and commit all kinds of horrible acts. We've seen this in real time, like, Rwanda. You can see these things. I mean, the Nazis, in a certain sense, are playing on that same kind of political emotion. Tragedy has to, in a certain sense, also rely on, I think, a first cousin of that emotion. He calls it fear, but it's fear for the character that you're watching, not fear for yourself. Because if you're afraid for you, you can't feel anything else.
So I think animation does as well.
Yes.
So The Lion King.
Yes.
I mean, that's a tragedy.
Yep.
I mean, you in many ways. I mean, it's
basically Hamlet. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I know it's kind of a kind of, cartoon, irony included version of that, but yeah, it is a tragedy.
Yeah, I think so. But it's an American tragedy.
Right. Well, it's Disney. Come on. It's Disney.
Right. Because it should end with him like falling with Scar to both of their deaths, right? Like that's how that movie should end. But no, we can't, because you got to sell product and there has to be a sequel. But
right. But that's where it's like one of those things where, kind of going back to the modes thing with the music that you were saying, is that kind of in modern society, we kind of just it feels like we just kind of get stuck in a loop of sorts of just the same thing. So for example, I like anticlimactic endings. I don't want to know everything. I don't care. It's not the point for me. I don't want it. Everyone lives happily ever after. I'm fine with you killing off a character middle of the movie. I'm fine with everyone dying at the end. Like those things, because there's something more about human life. There's something more about how we understand the world. Like those things, like No Country for Old Men is a great film for me because it ends in an anticlimactic way. And it's just, here it is. And like, you don't have the resolution. I don't want that all the time, but I think that there's something more thoughtful or something deeper about it than just, you
have a more tragic sensibility than the American sitcom.
I do. I mean, the minor keys are my favorite with music. I like Beethoven and Rachmaninoff. I mean, right. I'm promise I'm not a depressive, melancholic person, but I do like things that kind of, I like Russian literature, but I like things that have kind of depth and meat on it. And I'm okay with, I don't know, playing around, but entertaining the themes of different types of suffering and kind of the things about the realities. But most people, right, everybody wants a Marvel movie, right? Where, nothing against Marvel, but, I mean, that's just so formulaic. I mean, it's just nothing, it just, at a certain point, it kind of becomes, old hat at a certain point.
So that's one of the interesting, so the two emotions that Aristotle attaches to tragedy, he did attach two to comedy, but those have been lost. That's part of the piece that we don't know. So we can't actually make a whole lot of assessments on comedy. He only has really one chapter where he talks about it in chapter 5. He doesn't really, there's not a whole lot there to sort of hang your hat on, but he does with tragedy a lot. And the two emotions that are attached to tragedy are, get translated as fear and pity. And it's phobos and aleos. And phobia, like that one's pretty, fear is pretty good. I think anxiety is probably more accurate to the way it's being used, because what you're wanting to develop is a sense of dread for what's going to happen to the people you're watching. It's not really fear for you. Again, it's not self-referential in that way. And aleos gets translated as pity, but that's sort of, I don't really like that, because the way we use pity now, I think, again, comes more through Rousseau, which presumes a kind of superiority looking down on someone, and I'm having pity on you. Gee whiz.
Is it more of a, I don't know all the Greek, but is it more of like an empathy or a compassion?
Empathy is what I argue it is.
Okay.
And he didn't have the word, because that word gets created in the 19th century. It's a really new word.
Yeah.
But and I don't think it's like sympathy, because sympathy would be literally in the etymology would, sympathia, to put together the passions. to put together the sufferings. We suffer together, which, I mean, that's what compassion is. Compassia. The one's Latin and one's Greek, but it's the same thing. Until Christianity gets a hold of it. That's an entire, like, another 2-hour conversation. But empathy, to be in the suffering, empatia, right? Means to sort of imagine or project oneself into someone else and to what would this be like? And I think that's far closer to his definition he gives in the rhetoric than pity is. Especially the way that we use pity. It might be accurate, to his sense then, but he didn't have the word pity. He had the word aleos, right? I'm translating here. Give me a break. But but I think what the point of it is, people who have the most developed sense of aleos, of empathy, are, for him, ones who have suffered, ones who are wise enough to know that they can suffer, ones who have attachments to people that they could lose. So they have the capacity for suffering. Those who are incapable of suffering have never suffered. So it's usually young people, or it's people who've had an excessive amount of success, or morons. That's the modern translation, right?
right. Idiots. But then
there's the biggest category, though. The caveat is the other people that can't feel empathy are the ones who are suffering too much on their own. Excessive amounts of suffering in you, like in the audience, negates your ability to feel for someone else. And I don't think we sort of culturally today spend enough time thinking about that. Everybody talked about an empathy deficit. Well, are the people stupid? Do they not have things they can lose? Or is it this hidden thing that there's an underlying sense of dread that people have for their own lives? Until you get past that, you can't make them feel empathy for somebody else. This isn't an insight. Aristotle wrote this in the 4th century. I mean, come on.
So, and it's, I'll be honest, I haven't read it. I know he's written about emotions, and I haven't read it in a while, but it's completely fascinating to me how it's like rereading Heraclitus, of the summer. It's just like, it's incredible to me how, I don't want to say prophetic, but how absolutely ahead of their time they were.
Insightful.
It's just, and especially really at bottom for humans, he's getting at all of those things. Cause I've obviously studied a little bit about, emotional theory and emotions and the science of it and all of that. And, it's not that far off. It's from what we understand from the science and from emotion research is very much in line with that. You can obviously, start splitting hairs and, obviously some of this stuff becomes, arguments about labels and taxonomy and, terms and all that. But overall, he's in the same universe for at least. And that's terribly fascinating to me about how just deep his insights are. It's incredible.
Well, and there's another passage, the one that really got me sort of hooked. So I had the big pop culture one. I really wanted to write about superheroes. That was really where I wanted to go with this because of the proliferation in the popular culture. It's everywhere. Like I remember growing up, I was born in 1986. So I went through school, I graduated in 2005, right? Yeah, 2005. When I was going through school, being a nerd was bad. Right. And now it is ubiquitous. Yes. It is the most milquetoast condition one can be. And it's because the culture has been hypersaturated. Probably a bit of revenge of the nerds here, right? They're now in charge, so they get to make the culture they want. But in another sense, there's something that they may have understood and tapped into just before the rest of the culture did. So it could be, maybe a little bit of both, but now it's everywhere. And the really important thing, and this has been true for several decades now, but it's increasingly true. These are the characters that our kids learn morality from because they role play.
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
And it was that insight that in Aristotle and then the Poetics, this is in 3 and in 4, where he lays out, this is the thing that makes human beings different from the other animals. We learn by, the word is imitation, and it's, the Greek is mimesis, to be mimetic, the transliteration. I think role playing is a much better term than imitating, but it's all wrapped in there together. Kids learn by pretending to be something else. And that's how human beings learn ethics. We learn by doing what the ethical person would do. Literally what the prudent person would do in a situation is the metric for whether or not you're being virtuous. How do you do that? you act as if you were prudent, which means it's an engaging of role playing. So human beings from children all the way up are engaging in this constant kind of play is the wrong word, but role playing, I think, is correct. And this was an insight. I had just read that after I had done an ed psych class. So we had done like Peugeot and
probably Bandera.
No, there was a Russian.
Hold on.
This was 6 years ago. So I'm sorry, Russian psychologist. I don't remember your name.
Vygotsky.
Yeah, Vygotsky. Thank you. Very good. And so we had just read both of them, and I'm thinking, the scaffolding and this kind of thing, but they're also in certain sense
zone of proximal development and scaffolding. I think it's Vygotsky.
Right. Yeah. But they're in some ways, yes, that language sounds correct. But in some ways they were circling around his insight, I think. And the insight was in essence, you develop scaffolding and zones of development by practicing the thing appropriate to you relative to that character. And if it's true for children, it's also true for adults. What's the way that we do that? We engage in role playing when we watch movies. It forces us to engage in these kinds of emotional things. Well, if that's changing the nature of our soul to do this, it puts us in a different mindset would be the better way of thinking about it. It changes how we think or how we act, but it in essence changes the way that we feel. And that's connected directly to the way in which we educate children to their appropriate level of development, but also the way that we teach people to be ethical. How could it not be that engaging with these things in the culture also are providing a kind of education, or means would be more accurate, a means to that kind of education? Now, this isn't to say, and I have to be very careful on this, this isn't to say that watching a movie makes you ethical. No, it's ridiculous, right?
Right.
But what it can do is it can force you to feel emotions that are particularly salient to a given condition. And since I think that the primary emotion in tragedies is empathy, that is perhaps, and this is another thing that I argue, this is my fourth chapter, that may be the most salient political emotion as well. To be able to understand perspectives from people that are like you enough that you could both imagine experiencing that suffering. If you can't, if you can't imagine yourself suffering like someone else did, you can't actually empathize with them. You can pretend, you can have fake empathy, but if there is not a possibility that you could ever be homeless, how could you ever empathize with someone who is homeless? Like if it's not possible, all you can perhaps do is say, gee whiz, that'd suck. But that's something very different from someone who says, I'm one paycheck away from being this person. Now you start flirting that sympathy, empathy line there a bit.
Yeah. So let me just briefly jump in here. So I'll make a kind of a hand wave here to, the research psychologist Paul Bloom, who's in Yale.
Yep. And Against Empathy.
Yeah, he wrote this book Against Empathy. He's written a bunch of papers on it. And, his basic premise is that, empathy is really good for a lot of things, but it should not be used for rational decisions. Right? We shouldn't use empathy to make decisions, but there are utilities for it. And he gives a few ways of basically recreating this. And then there's some other things I've read in the psychological literature that also are, this is where I do think taxonomy does become important. But, he says that you can have a type of cognitive empathy, right? Like I can know, or I can imagine what it is to know, which is kind of going on what you're saying, what it's like to feel what somebody else is feeling. I can do a kind of emotional empathy where I actually feel, or as best I can, exactly what the other person is feeling as much as you're able to. Those are two different things, right? One's an emotional state, one's a kind of more cognitive mental state. And then he goes further to say something that we probably need, because compassion is probably bigger, which is somewhat different. It's how do I put myself in somebody's situation, but then how do you're using that to try and, there's an understanding, but then you can do certain actions from it. So the example I think he gives is if you see somebody you're walking on a path, or you're going for a jog and you see a small girl and they're drowning in a lake, I don't need to feel empathy to do something. right? I don't need to feel how does she feel to have water going in her lungs? And she must feel a lot of terror and fear. You don't need to do that, right?
Right. Well, and who does?
Right.
You know what I mean?
You just either go and you jump in, you save her, or you could call someone to jump in and save her, but you just need compassion, which is different. And, this is different, but he does use that the utility of emotional empathy can be really helpful when you're watching a film, because you're putting yourself in the position of the character and you're feeling the feelings. And it's a weird thing because if you really think about it, it's super meta, because it's like the amount of abstraction is you're seeing moving pictures on a screen. And let's say the camera is simulating of sorts because you're viewing it. And so you're looking at through the lens of the camera. And so when a character, so it's an actor playing somebody that's looking at you through the camera in all of your, there's just all of those, like the levels of abstraction from a brain behavior function is tremendous. And no one's thinking about this when they're watching a movie, but you feel what the person's feeling. Or even if you're not feeling what they're feeling, you're observing it, and then you're feeling sad, right? It's like, why did I cry my eyes out when was it Riley and Inside Out at the end of the movie is super upset and sad, and finally it's just like, this gets me every time, because I know what that feels like, or I have an idea of what it is to feel like that. And there's something, the fact that there's a part of your brain that knows this isn't real allows you to access, I can have these feelings, and that can be an experience that's very purposeful or instructive, which is very useful. You wouldn't want to do that. Like for me, I don't do emotional empathy when I'm with my clients, because I would be absolutely burnt out. I can't see 6, 7, 8 people a day in therapy and have emotional empathy. I need an IV at the end of the day. So I use mostly cognitive empathy. What is it like? How could I imagine how this would feel like? That must be very difficult, but I'm not trying to actively feel those feelings. And so there's, he lays out all the differences, but I think I'm just making that detour there because it says, in terms of how the Aristotelian way of doing it is, there is some way in which there's a purpose for certain mediums or certain things where you're supposed to have the good, or you're supposed to have certain types of states that have some type of directionality to them and or some purpose, is what it sounds like.
Well, and so what you're getting at there, and I remember reading in Bloom's book, because I think he ends up calling it, we need rational compassion or something. That's right. That effect.
That's right. Yeah.
It struck me that what he's playing a different game than I was necessarily doing, because I was just trying to find an approximation for a translation, because the best word to use for it is aleos, because that's the Greek. Right. But the closest that we can get to the approximation, the distinctions in those various forms of empathy, I think are really interesting in terms of modern psychology. I couldn't find a way to map them onto Aristotle, because I think he parses out the experiences slightly differently.
Yes. I would, in my reading of Aristotle, and I don't know what Bloom has done. I think he's done some Descartes and stuff, but I don't know how much he's read of Aristotle. I'm assuming he has, but at least doesn't write about as much. But yes, that there's a different way that Aristotle will explain those different experiences, right?
And well, even when it comes to like the emotion piece here, feeling empathy is painful. Yes. Why in God's name would you want to spend your leisure time in pain, right? And this is a problem that he sort of wrestles with, but not very well. This is another piece we presume is part of the lost text. So there is a plethora, just a huge amount of people that have tried to untangle what the word catharsis means. And just thousands of pages just on it. So much is on this. And it's a word he uses like 4 times. It's not seminal in the text. Mm-hmm. And yet somehow it exists at the intersection of the emotion and the release, that it is seminal. Mm-hmm. And where I think that the piece there that where I would sort of, and again, I don't have the psychology to disagree with Bloom. From my understanding of Aristotle is The emotional arousal is not the pleasurable part. It's the release of it. And the release of it comes from the story being intelligible. Again, this is why it's so important that the end makes sense relative to the beginning. If I don't know, like the Marvel movies, I guess we can say spoiler alert but these have been out for a while. So
they've been out for a couple of years. So
yeah. So when Tony Stark dies in Endgame, and which is this emotionally overwhelming experience. If you've been watching all the way along and it happens, everybody basically knew it was happening. You're very close to it. Doesn't matter. Gut punch. And because you've so invested in the character, and there's a certain amount of I wish I was like that. I wish I could. But if he died because a ricocheted bullet hit him in the head, that would piss you off, right? And so surprises like that don't work. They don't release that necessary emotion. They fill you with a different one. One that cancels, right? But it's a different one. And this is where in the rhetoric, it's so important because he attaches these political emotions as basically flip sides to the same coin. Indignation and pity, same thing, but one is you are sad, you are feeling pain for their suffering, you are angry at the given suffering or condition. So we could create stories that their purpose was to arouse indignation and release it. We could do that. It wouldn't be very easy, but it's artistically possible to get to the end. And at the end, what you would say is that person got what was coming to them. And so the German on that is Schadenfreude, right? Joy at the end. The Greek have a version of this, which literally means joy from harm, epikareikakia, and to have joy at someone's suffering. That's going to be the release of indignation. And I've mused elsewhere that I think that our culture is overwhelming in those two emotions. Like we want to be angry about everything, and we're really glad when that so-and-so got what was coming to them. It's not terribly
justice
helpful.
Thing, which kind of
but so justice
back to
would
what Rawls talks about, right?
Well, but so justice would be that person earned the thing they deserved. It isn't that so-and-so over there was completely ruined and destroyed, and isn't that wonderful?
Yes, I see the difference. Yes.
So yeah, justice is a sense of sort of balancing out or giving the thing that it's due, as opposed to Schadenfreude. You're Nelson from The Simpsons, and but so the importance of why is it aleos? Why is this the emotion? Again, since everything has to have a purpose, they can't just be accidental. That's the reason that this sort of developed, or even if it was, why it was preserved, because it has to serve a function. And here, where I think the importance of the arousal and release of that specific emotion, the ability to see someone as being like you, that means you can experience the world in a similar sense. And this is fairly abstract. I mean, we're talking about like how many people really can imagine what it would be like to be Oedipus? He's the king of a city, right? And he's had all this, and he's incredibly clever. And all these other things, who can really imagine that? And yet, when you get to the end, it is horrifying.
Oh yeah.
And if you really watch it, it's a gut wrenching experience to watch him experience this. And the other play, the Philoctetes, there are other ones that really really are gripping and very painful. And why would we do this to ourselves? Are we a bunch of sadomasochists? No, it's because when we get to the end, we understand that the cause of their undoing came from something in their character.
Yeah.
Now, this gets interpreted by people as saying they were fated to do this. But that's not, I'm going to even say this even stronger. That's not correct. It's not that I disagree. It's like, I think that's incorrect, because fate would presume that, they didn't have a choice in the matter. So they're not morally culpable for the thing. So they aren't the cause. The cause is external to them. So it wouldn't actually make me think, boy, so-and-so caused their own demise. No, you get to the end and you'd be pissed off at the fate, So that can't work. Instead, it has to be, and this is where I think Hamilton is a classic example of a tragedy. We're introduced to him I'm assuming, have you watched it or listened to it? And
I've watched it, yeah.
So if you haven't, go do it. Again, spoilers, he dies at the end.
Right. Well, I knew the history, so I mean.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the people who were upset that the boat sinks in Titanic. What did you think was going to happen?
Right.
So anyway, we introduced it to Hamilton at the beginning, and the very first song lays out, this kid's got a bunch of ambition. Mm-hmm. And I'm not throwing away my shot. It's just ambition, ambition. Right. And what's the thing that fundamentally undoes him? It's he misjudges the character of Aaron Burr in a contest over their ambition.
Yeah.
And it costs him his life. Mm-hmm. I think that's a classic laid out Greek tragedy.
Well, and the wonderful thing about it, that's even more so in terms of the tragedy, in terms of how you're talking about the method and the structure, is that really happened, right. Which means that it happened 200 years ago. Right. And it's like, that's human. There's human things in that. And you could, I won't bring up, well, I'll bring it up, but we won't talk about it. How you could, I'm sure you could do this with Star Wars, right? And I mean, Star Wars is so many themes from so many different places. Okay. I am mindful of our time. And so we will probably have to pause here, both for your time, my time, and our bladders. So,
and the poor audience.
Oh God, it's too much. I mean, I feel like I say this every time, but it's just really true here, especially today. Is I could literally go for another 2-3 hours. I mean, this stuff is so fascinating, and the way you explain it is great. Obviously, your knowledge is incredible about this stuff, and you've been in the trenches with all of this. So, yeah, I mean, I don't speak often about, or at length and in depth about Aristotle, and I feel like he is super important. There is the one question which we'll have to table, but this whole idea of purpose, and I wonder if we confabulate that with purpose and value, and could something have a purpose but have multiple value points? And so there's my Nietzsche kind of eye wink there. But we have to get you back here again and talk about that and continue it. But any kind of final thoughts about any of the things we've discussed today, and then just let people know where they can find you online and everything else.
Yeah, I guess I will conclude I'll give as pithy as I can on Aristotle. Judgment matters. And I think if you're ever to read Aristotle, that's the most important central takeaway.
That's nice.
That you can make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. The importance is the judgment that's attached to it. Learn how to make better judgments. And again, talk about increasing relevance. So I'll leave him there for now. The one is never done with Aristotle. People can come find me if you want to endure my ranting on Twitter. I'm there at what is my handle, at sclouse2, I think. Okay. And I also have a podcast.
That's right.
If anybody wants to come check that out. It's called The Struggle to Understand. And again, I derive this from Aristotle. The beginning of his metaphysics, it gets translated as the desire to know. All men by nature desire to know is how it gets translated. I think it's better that the word there, desire, the verb is to stretch for. And I think it's a much better image to say human beings and their nature struggle to understand things.
Yeah, it's nice.
And so that's what the sort of the point of the podcast is. My attempt at that struggle. And to talk to people about theirs, to see if we can, engage to struggle together so we can understand a bit more. So if you're interested, please come hang out.
Everyone go check it out. I've listened to a few episodes, and it's great. So, Thank
you very much for having me on too, by the way. This was really enjoyable.
Yeah, no, I really, really enjoyed it. I mean, I like philosophy, and just as I'm not sure when I'll post this, but I did put a poll on Twitter, and I said, kind of just some topics, what do people want to hear more about? And philosophy won. So hopefully this will make people happy. It definitely has made me very happy. And so I appreciate you for your time and your energy and all of your thoughts. And we'll have to do this again soon.
We certainly will. Thank you again so much.
Of course. All right.